She caught her husband cheating 30 minutes before walking down the aisle. Her revenge destroyed his life. Her response was genius. Instead of canceling the $500,000 wedding, she turned the reception into a public execution. Multimillionaire Amelia Richardson walked in on her groom Tyler and maid of honor, Rachel, planning to steal her fortune after the ceremony. What she did next became the most savage wedding revenge in history. The result? Her cheating husband lost everything and got 10 years in federal prison. Tyler thought he was marrying a naive trust fund baby. He had no idea she was recording every conversation, tracking every lie, and building a legal case that would destroy him completely. This isn't just revenge. It's a masterclass in strategic warfare. You're about to see how one woman turned betrayal into total victory using surveillance technology, legal manipulation, and psychological warfare. She exposed her cheaters in front of 200 guests, seized all her husband's assets with documents he signed himself, and triggered federal fraud charges that landed them both behind bars. Every woman who's been betrayed needs to see this. The discovery. 6 weeks before what should have been the happiest day of her life, Amelia Richardson stood frozen outside her bridal suite, listening to sounds that made her stomach turn. Tyler's familiar laugh, mixed with breathless whispers from Rachel, her best friend since college and chosen maid of honor. She'd only returned for her grandmother's pearl earrings, forgotten in the rush to get her hair done. Now she wished she'd never come back. The key card beeped softly. The door opened silently. What she saw would haunt her forever. Tyler, her groom, was tangled up with Rachel on the pristine white sofa where Amelia had practiced her vows just yesterday. Their wedding clothes hung nearby, his tuxedo and her bridesmaid dress carelessly discarded. "I can't believe we're doing this on her wedding day," Rachel whispered. "She'll never know," Tyler replied, kissing Rachel's neck. "After today, we'll have to be more careful, but we can make this work. You in the guest house, her in the main house. Perfect setup." Amelia's knees nearly gave out. They were planning to continue this affair after the wedding, in her own home, in the guest house she'd lovingly renovated for Rachel while she recovered from her divorce. What if she finds out? Rachel asked with fake concern that made Amelia's blood boil. She won't. Amelia's too trusting, too naive. She sees the best in everyone, even when they don't deserve it. It's what makes her so easy to fool. The words hit like physical blows. How long had they been laughing behind her back? "I feel bad sometimes," Rachel continued, though her actions suggested otherwise. "She really loves you. And I love her money." Tyler laughed cruelly. "Do you know what she's worth? The trust fund, the inheritance from her parents, the business she built. Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. We can take our time, enjoy ourselves, and when the time is right, maybe I'll divorce her and we can split everything." Amelia's heart shattered completely. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving her their fortune and successful marketing firm. She'd thought Tyler loved her for who she was, not what she was worth. "You're terrible," Rachel giggled, "but I love that about you. When did you first know you wanted me instead of her?" "Honestly, the day I met you. But Amelia came with better benefits. You understand, right, baby?" The decision. Amelia backed away from the door, her designer heels clicking softly on marble floors. In 30 minutes, she was supposed to walk down the aisle. 200 guests were already seated below. The photographer was waiting. The minister was ready. Her phone buzzed. "Where are you? We need to start final touches in 15 minutes. Another text from Rachel. "Girl, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." The audacity was breathtaking. Rachel was texting her while probably still naked with Tyler. Amelia wanted to scream, to run, to call everything off and expose them both. But then Tyler's words echoed. She's too trusting, too naive. Maybe she had been, but she wasn't anymore. The elevator reached the lobby. Amelia walked past bustling wedding staff, past florists making last-minute adjustments, past guests mingling with champagne. She walked straight to the business center and sat down at a computer. If Tyler thought she was naive, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Amelia had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. She'd survived her parents' death and emerged stronger. She'd fought through a male-dominated industry and earned every dollar. She wasn't going to run away crying. She was going to make them pay the performance. 20 minutes later, her wedding planner found her. Amelia, thank God. We need to get you upstairs right now. Amelia saved her work and logged out. She checked her reflection once more. Her tears had dried, and her resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. I'm ready, she said calmly. But she wasn't ready to be Tyler's naive little wife. She was ready for war. Back in the bridal suite, Rachel frantically searched through makeup bags, her hair slightly messed, but otherwise looking perfectly innocent. There you are, Rachel exclaimed with fake relief. I was so worried. Where were you? Just getting some air, Amelia replied evenly, watching for any sign of guilt. There was none. Tyler knocked on the door. Ladies, can I steal my bride for just 1 second? You know it's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, Rachel called out, but opened the door anyway. Tyler's face was the picture of loving devotion. I just wanted to tell you how beautiful you look and how much I love you. Amelia stared at this man she'd planned to spend her life with. His perfectly styled hair, sparkling blue eyes, and that same smile that had made her fall in love 2 years ago. Now she saw it for what it really was, a performance. I love you too, she heard herself say. The words felt like poison. I'll see you at the altar, Mrs. Soon-to-be Morrison. Tyler blew her a kiss and disappeared. He's so romantic, Rachel squealed. You're so lucky, Amelia. The irony was suffocating the ceremony. The walk down the aisle felt endless. 200 faces turned toward Amelia, their expressions full of joy and admiration. Everything was exactly as she'd planned for months. White roses and baby's breath, her mother's favorite song, the perfect venue. At the altar stood Tyler in his tailored tuxedo, his face lighting up as he saw her. Rachel beamed from the bridesmaids' lineup, playing the loyal best friend perfectly. If Amelia hadn't witnessed what she had an hour ago, this would have been the most perfect moment of her life. The minister began, Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Tyler Morrison and Amelia Richardson in holy matrimony. Amelia's mind raced. She could stop this right now. She could expose everything in front of all these people. But what would that accomplish? Public humiliation? A ruined wedding? Questions and gossip that would follow her for years? No. If Tyler wanted to play games, she would show him how the game was really played. Tyler, the minister said, do you take Amelia to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, till death do you part? I do, Tyler said clearly, never leaving Amelia's face. Liar, Amelia thought, keeping her expression serene. And Amelia, do you take Tyler to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, till death do you part? This was her last chance to stop the charade. Every person in that room waited for her answer. Amelia looked at Tyler, really looked at him. She saw the confidence in his eyes, the certainty that she would say yes because she was too naive, too trusting, too much in love to do anything else. She saw a man who thought he had already won. "I do," she said clearly. Tyler's smile was radiant. They exchanged rings, and the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Tyler lifted her veil and kissed her softly as the crowd erupted in cheers. It was picture perfect. It was everything Amelia had dreamed of. It was also the beginning of Tyler's worst nightmare, though he didn't know it yet. The preparation. 3 days after the wedding, Amelia sat in her home office, staring at her computer screen. Tyler had officially moved in, his belongings scattered throughout their bedroom, his presence feeling like an invasion. Her phone buzzed with a text from her cousin Brandon. "Got the equipment, ready when you are." Brandon was 25, brilliant with computers, and currently unemployed after quitting his tech startup job. During a quiet moment at the reception, Amelia had recruited him for what she called a favor that could change everything. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison," Brandon said with a slight smirk when she let him in. "Don't call me that," Amelia replied. They settled in her office, and Brandon unpacked his equipment: micro cameras, audio recorders, software for recovering deleted texts and emails. "First, we need evidence of the affair," Brandon explained. "You saw them together, but that's just your word against theirs. We need proof that will hold up in court." He pulled out a camera no bigger than a button. "This streams directly to your phone. We put it in the guest house where Rachel's staying, and we'll catch them in the act. What if they don't meet there? Then we get creative. I can clone Tyler's phone, which means every text, call, and email he sends will also come to you. Technically, you're married now, and in California, you have the right to monitor shared devices." Within an hour, they had their surveillance strategy. Brandon would install equipment while Tyler was at work, and Rachel was downtown at her new job. Amelia would continue playing the happy wife while secretly documenting everything. "There's one more thing," Brandon said. "You mentioned wanting to make them pay publicly. I've been working on a website that looks exactly like a popular social media platform, but is actually hosted on my private servers. We can use it to accidentally leak information to the right people at the right time." The evidence. That afternoon, while Tyler was in meetings and Rachel was at work, Brandon installed cameras in the guest house bedroom, living room, and kitchen. Audio recorders went by the front door. Everything was invisible and undetectable. Perfect quality, crystal clear audio. Brandon confirmed as Amelia watched the feed on her laptop from the main house. "If they meet here, we'll capture everything." 2 weeks later, Amelia had enough evidence to destroy Tyler and Rachel 10 times over. Brandon's surveillance captured them meeting almost daily, sometimes for hours. The recordings revealed not just their physical affair, but detailed plans to manipulate Amelia and eventually steal her money. But Amelia wanted more than just a divorce settlement. She wanted justice, public, humiliating, and complete. That's when inspiration struck. Tyler's sister Emma was getting married in 6 weeks, and Amelia was supposed to give a speech about love and marriage. The guest list included Tyler's entire family, business colleagues, and social circle. It was perfect. "You want to do what?" Brandon asked when Amelia explained her plan. "I want to wait until Emma's wedding reception and expose them there, in front of everyone who matters to Tyler." "That's brilliant, but also nuclear. You'll destroy Emma's wedding day. Emma has never liked me. She thinks Tyler married beneath himself. She'll get over it. And honestly, she'll have the most talked about wedding in family history." The trap. Over the next month, Amelia played her part perfectly. She told Tyler she'd finally decided to move forward with merging their companies, something he'd been pushing since their engagement. But instead of giving Tyler half her company, the documents actually signed his company over to her entirely, along with his personal assets as part of a marital unity clause. Tyler was so excited about finally accessing Amelia's money that he barely glanced at the contracts before signing. "This is the best day of my life," he said, signing the last page. "We're going to be so powerful together, baby. Nothing can stop us now." Amelia smiled and signed her name with a flourish. "Nothing at all." Meanwhile, surveillance continued. Tyler and Rachel had grown bolder, meeting in Amelia's own bedroom when they thought she was at work. The recordings revealed increasingly detailed plans and increasingly cruel comments. "She actually thinks I love her," Tyler had said just the day before. "It's almost sad how gullible she is." "I know," Rachel replied. "Sometimes I feel bad about lying to her face every day, but then I remember how much money we're going to have. Once I have legal control of her assets, we can start moving money offshore. Then we'll divorce her and disappear. She'll never see us or her money again." Listening to that conversation, Amelia felt the last remnants of her love for Tyler die completely. The reckoning. Standing in the bridal suite at Emma's wedding venue, Amelia felt calm for the first time in months. Today was the day Tyler and Rachel's world would end. Emma looked beautiful, fussing with her veil in the mirror. "Amelia, thank you so much for being here today. I know Tyler's lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Amelia replied, meaning it. She was lucky to have discovered the truth before Tyler could execute his plan. "Are you nervous about your speech tonight?" "Not at all. I've been looking forward to it for weeks." The ceremony was beautiful. Emma and her groom exchanged heartfelt vows, while Tyler stood with the groomsmen, looking handsome and respectable. Rachel sat in the third row, dabbing at her eyes during emotional moments. At the reception, Amelia mingled graciously, accepting compliments and making small talk about married life. Several people mentioned how lucky Tyler was and how happy they seemed together. As dinner wound down, Amelia knew it was time. Brandon was positioned in the back with a laptop and projector. Victoria, her sister, was near the exits to ensure Tyler and Rachel couldn't escape. The DJ handed Amelia the microphone. The room quieted, all eyes turning to her. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Emma and Michael," Amelia began. "It's wonderful to see so much love in one room." Tyler beamed from his table, raising his champagne glass. "Emma asked me to speak about love and marriage, about what makes a relationship work, and I have to say, the last few months have taught me so much about both." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. "I've learned that love requires honesty, that marriage requires trust, and that when those things are absent," Amelia paused, looking directly at Tyler, whose smile was starting to falter. "Well, when those things are absent, you get what Tyler and I have." The room went silent. "Some of you might be wondering what I mean by that," Amelia continued. "Tyler and I have been married for 6 weeks now, and it's been quite an educational experience." Tyler's face had gone pale. Across the room, Rachel looked frozen with fear. "You see, I learned something very important on my wedding day. I learned that the two people I trusted most in the world had been betraying me for months." Gasps arose from the crowd. Emma stood up, her face a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Amelia, what are you doing?" Tyler called out, panic in his voice. "I'm giving a speech about love and marriage, just like Emma asked. I'm sharing what I've learned about the importance of honesty in relationships." She gestured to Brandon, who pressed a key on his laptop. The large screens around the room suddenly displayed Tyler and Rachel in a passionate embrace in the guest house. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Emma screamed. Several people knocked over their chairs standing up. "This photo was taken 4 days after my wedding," Amelia announced over the chaos, "in the guest house that I renovated specifically for Rachel to live in. Tyler pushed through the crowd toward her, his face furious. Amelia, stop this right now. What? I thought you'd want everyone to see how happy you are with Rachel. Brandon clicked to the next image. Tyler and Rachel in Amelia's own bedroom. This one was taken in our bedroom last Tuesday while I was at work. The room erupted. Tyler's father stood up, red with rage. Emma was crying hysterically. Rachel had buried her face in her hands. You psychotic bitch, Tyler shouted, reaching the front. How dare you do this here? How dare I? Amelia laughed coldly. Tyler, you've been sleeping with my best friend since before our wedding. You've been planning to steal my money and abandon me, and you're asking how I dare expose the truth? Brandon clicked again, and audio began playing through the sound system. Tyler's voice filled the room. She'll never know. Amelia's too trusting, too naive. Tyler lunged for the microphone, but security guards hired specifically for this moment blocked his path. The audio continued with Rachel's voice. What if she finds out? Tyler's recorded response echoed through the silent room. She won't, and I love her money. Do you know what she's worth? Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. Angry shouts erupted. Tyler's own family members looked at him with disgust. There's more, Amelia said. Brandon, play the recording from last week. Rachel's voice. Sometimes I feel bad about lying to her face every day, but then I remember how much money we're going to have. Tyler again. Once I have legal control of her assets, we can start moving money offshore. Then we'll divorce her and disappear. She'll never see us or her money again. Emma's new husband had his arm around his sobbing bride. Get out, he said quietly. Both of you get out right now. Actually, there's one more thing you all should know, Amelia continued. Last month, Tyler was so eager to get his hands on my assets that he signed merger papers without reading them carefully. Tyler's face went from red to white. What are you talking about? Well, darling husband, those papers you signed didn't give you half my company like you thought. They signed your company over to me. Your house, your cars, your bank accounts, everything you own now belongs to me. That's impossible, Tyler whispered. Brandon, would you mind displaying the signature page? The screen showed legal documents, with Tyler's signature clearly visible, transferring all his assets to Amelia Richardson Morrison. You tricked me. Tyler stared in horror. I learned from the best, Amelia replied. You taught me that sometimes people don't read what they sign when they're blinded by greed. Emma's father-in-law, a prominent judge, stood up. Young lady, you've handled this with remarkable grace. Tyler, Rachel, I suggest you leave immediately before I call the police. As security escorted Tyler and Rachel out, the room buzzed with conversation. Some guests were in shock, others expressing admiration for Amelia's strategy, and a few already pulling out phones to share the story. Emma approached Amelia, eyes red but no longer crying. I'm sorry about Tyler. I had no idea he was capable of this. I'm sorry I ruined your reception, Amelia replied genuinely. Emma surprised her by laughing. Are you kidding? This is the most memorable wedding reception in family history. People will be talking about this for years. The aftermath. The next morning, Amelia woke up alone in her own bed for the first time in weeks, and it felt wonderful. Tyler had spent the night in a hotel, calling nonstop until she blocked his number. Her phone rang at 8:00 a.m. Her lawyer, Patricia Chin, Amelia, what happened last night? I'm getting calls from reporters. The wedding reception went exactly as planned, Amelia said calmly. Did you file the papers? Tyler's assets are now frozen pending investigation. His business accounts, his house, everything. He can't touch a penny without court approval. Perfect. And the other matter? The FBI is very interested in the financial fraud evidence you provided. Moving money offshore to hide it from a spouse during divorce proceedings is a federal crime. Tyler could be looking at serious jail time. Amelia had spent weeks documenting not just the affair, but Tyler's financial plans. The recordings captured him discussing hiding assets, falsifying business records, and planning to flee the country with her money. What about Rachel? Conspiracy to commit fraud. Plus, she signed documents as a witness that she had to know were false. She's looking at charges too. By noon, the story had exploded across social media. Someone had live streamed part of Amelia's speech, and the video was going viral. Wedding Revenge was trending nationwide. The most satisfying call came from Tyler himself, using a friend's phone. "You have destroyed my entire life," he said without preamble. "No, Tyler, you destroyed your own life when you decided to betray me. I just made sure everyone knew about it. I'll fight this. I'll prove those documents were fraudulent. Go ahead and try. You signed them in front of witnesses, including my lawyer. The documents clearly state what they are. It's not my fault you were too greedy and arrogant to read them properly. Amelia, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. I love you." Her laugh was genuine and bitter. "Tyler, I heard you on tape saying you only loved my money. I heard you planning to abandon me and leave me with nothing. You don't love me. You never did. I can change. I can be the man you need me to be. The man I needed you to be was honest, faithful, and trustworthy. That ship has sailed. So that's it? You're just going to throw away our marriage? I'm not throwing anything away. You threw it away the moment you decided to sleep with my best friend and plot to steal my money. I'm just cleaning up the mess." After hanging up, Amelia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For months, she'd been living a lie. Now the truth was out, and she was free. The new beginning. 6 months later, Amelia stood in the conference room of her expanded company, looking out at the team of executives she'd assembled. The merger with Tyler's former company had been more successful than she'd hoped, and they were preparing to open offices in London and Tokyo. "The international expansion is ahead of schedule," reported her new CFO. "We should be operational in both locations by year's end." Tyler's company was performing dramatically better under new management. Amelia had discovered he'd been cutting corners, overcharging clients, and skimming profits while running operations into the ground. Her relationship with divorce attorney Jake Harrison had progressed from professional to personal to something deeper than anything she'd experienced with Tyler. Jake was honest, straightforward, and genuinely interested in Amelia as a person rather than her bank account. "Tyler's been asking to meet with you," Jake mentioned during one of their weekly updates. "He wants to apologize and see if there's any way to work things out." "Absolutely not." Amelia's response was immediate. "I told him you'd say that, but he's persistent. He's convinced you still have feelings for him. The man is delusional. I heard him on tape planning to rob and abandon me. What could he possibly say that would change any of that?" Jake leaned forward. "Can I ask you something personal? Do you still love him, even a little?" Amelia considered carefully. "No, I don't love Tyler. I'm not even sure I ever really loved Tyler. I loved the person I thought he was, but that person was a lie." "Good," Jake said quietly, then reached into his jacket pocket. "Because I've been wanting to ask you out for weeks." 1 year later, Amelia stood on the balcony of her new London office, watching the sunset over the Thames. Richardson International was now one of the fastest growing marketing firms in the world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Saw the news about Tyler's sentencing. How are you feeling?" Tyler had been sentenced that morning to 10 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 7 years. Rachel received 3 years, but would likely be released in 18 months with good behavior. Amelia typed back, "Free. I feel completely free." And she did. The news brought no satisfaction or sadness, just finality. That chapter was closed permanently. Jake entered carrying champagne glasses and wearing the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "I thought we should toast," he said, "to justice being served, to your incredible success, to us." He paused, reaching into his jacket, "and to our future." Jake pulled out a small velvet box and dropped to one knee. "Amelia Richardson, you are the strongest, most brilliant, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You've shown me what real love looks like: honest, generous, and fearless. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Amelia said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes. I have one condition," she added when they broke apart from their kiss. "Anything. Prenup, non-negotiable." Jake laughed, already drawn up and waiting for your review. "I figured you'd want to protect your assets after everything you went through." "And you're okay with that?" "Amelia, I fell in love with you, not your bank account. I have my own money, my own career, my own life. I want to share all of that with you, not take what's yours." It was such a simple concept, but Tyler had never understood it. Real love was about addition, not subtraction, building something together, not tearing each other down. Later that evening, as they walked along the Thames, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been devastated by betrayal, feeling naive and broken. But she hadn't stayed broken. She'd rebuilt herself into someone stronger, smarter, and more confident than ever before. She'd turned Tyler's weapons against him and emerged victorious in every possible way. "Do you ever regret how you handled things?" Jake asked. "Do you mean destroying Tyler and Rachel publicly instead of divorcing quietly?" Amelia thought seriously. "No, I don't regret it at all. Tyler wasn't just cheating. He was planning to rob and abandon me. He saw me as a victim he could use and discard. If I'd handled it quietly, he would have learned nothing and might have done the same to someone else. I admire that about you. You don't let people walk all over you. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought. Tyler called me naive and trusting, and maybe I was, but I'm not anymore. I know how to protect myself now, and you know how to fight back. Yes, and I know how to win." The woman looking back at her in their hotel mirror was confident, successful, and genuinely happy. She bore little resemblance to the broken bride who discovered her husband's betrayal a year ago. That woman had been a victim. This woman was a victor. Tyler Morrison had wanted to destroy Amelia Richardson and steal her life. Instead, he'd given her the greatest gift possible, the knowledge of her own power. And Amelia Richardson was just getting started.
A homeless girl returned. A billionaire's lost wallet at what he did next shocked everyone. A homeless teenager found a wallet containing $50,000 in cash and cards that could access billions. But what she did next will shatter every assumption you have about human nature. This is the story of Luna Martinez, a 17-year-old living in cardboard boxes, who made a split-second decision that exposed the darkest secret of America's elite and accidentally triggered the largest act of generosity in modern history. What the billionaire did when she returned his wallet will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about wealth, poverty, and the invisible threads that connect us all. But first, you need to understand just how desperate Luna's situation really was. The December wind cut through downtown Chicago like a serrated knife, turning every breath into visible proof of survival. Luna Martinez pressed herself deeper into the loading dock behind Millennium Tower, her entire worldly possessions crammed into a garbage bag that served as both pillow and shield against the concrete that had become her bed. At 17, Luna had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd learned too early that the world's safety nets had holes large enough for entire human beings to fall through. Her clothes, 3 donated sweaters layered under a torn winter coat, carried the permanent smell of the streets, exhaust fumes, desperation, and the particular staleness that comes from sleeping in places never meant for human habitation. She'd been homeless for 8 months, ever since aging out of the foster system with nothing but a bus ticket and a social worker's hollow promise that things would work out. Things, as it turned out, had not worked out. The youth shelter had a 6-month limit. The job at McDonald's disappeared when she had no address for tax forms. The community college dreams evaporated when she couldn't afford the application fees. The path that led Luna to this frozen loading dock was paved with the kind of institutional failures that make headlines but rarely change lives. Her story began not with a single catastrophic event, but with a cascade of small betrayals by the very systems designed to protect vulnerable children. Luna's mother, Maria Martinez, had been a nurse at Chicago General Hospital, one of those quietly heroic people who worked double shifts to keep their small family afloat. When Maria received her cancer diagnosis, she fought with the same fierce determination she'd shown caring for her patients. But cancer doesn't negotiate with determination, and the medical bills that followed were astronomical enough to bankrupt a small nation. Luna still remembered the night her mother sat her down, tears streaming down her face to explain that they were losing their apartment. Mija, Maria had whispered, her voice breaking. Sometimes life hits us with waves bigger than we can handle, but you're stronger than you know. You're going to survive this storm. 3 months later, Maria was gone, and Luna was thrust into a foster care system that was already stretched beyond its breaking point. The statistics were brutal. Every year, approximately 20,000 young people aged out of foster care in America, and within 4 years, half would be homeless, pregnant, or incarcerated. Luna was determined not to become another statistic, but determination, she learned, wasn't always enough. Her first foster family, the Johnsons, seemed promising. They lived in a suburban house with a yard and spoke about giving Luna stability and opportunity. But within weeks, it became clear that their primary interest was the monthly stipend that came with housing a foster child. Luna slept on a mattress in the basement, ate different meals from the family, and was expected to provide unpaid childcare for their biological children. When she reported the conditions to her caseworker, she was moved to another home, then another. Each placement brought new disappointments, new forms of neglect or abuse, new reasons to believe that the system saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be protected. The final placement was with the Hendersons, a couple who ran what Luna later realized was essentially a group home disguised as a family. They housed 6 foster children in a 3-bedroom house, collected the stipends, and provided minimal supervision or care. It was there that Luna learned the most important lesson of her adolescence. She could only depend on herself. When she aged out at 17, Luna was handed a bus ticket, a garbage bag containing her few possessions, and a pamphlet about transitional services that existed mostly on paper. She found herself in downtown Chicago with $47 in cash and no idea how to navigate the adult world that had suddenly become her reality. The first month was a crash course in urban survival. Luna learned which library bathrooms had the best soap dispensers, which restaurants might give her leftover food at closing time, and which police officers would move her along gently versus which ones would confiscate her belongings. She discovered that being a homeless teenager made her simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, ignored by most adults, but constantly watched by those who might exploit her vulnerability. She managed to get the job at McDonald's by using the address of a 24-hour laundromat and having mail sent there. For 6 weeks, she was optimistic. She was earning money, had a routine, and was slowly saving enough to afford a security deposit on a room somewhere. But when the manager needed her actual address for tax paperwork, the carefully constructed lie collapsed. Without a permanent address, she couldn't keep the job. Without the job, she couldn't afford an address. The youth shelter provided temporary relief, but their 6-month limit meant she was eventually back on the streets. The waiting lists for affordable housing were years long. The requirements for most assistance programs seemed designed to exclude people in her exact situation: too old for children's services, too young for adult programs, too poor to afford the documents required to prove her poverty. By December, Luna had developed the kind of street wisdom that comes from necessity. She knew which buildings had unlocked stairwells, which construction sites had temporary heating, and which hospital emergency rooms would let her sit for hours without asking questions. She'd learned to make herself small and quiet, to avoid eye contact with police officers, and to recognize the predatory looks of men who saw homeless teenage girls as easy targets. But no amount of street wisdom could prepare her for the Chicago winter. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Luna had already had 2 close calls with hypothermia, and she knew that her luck was running out. The city's emergency shelters were overcrowded, with waiting lists that stretched around the block. The warming centers closed during the day, forcing people back onto the streets regardless of temperature. It was in this context, cold, hungry, and genuinely afraid she might not survive the winter, that Luna found herself pressing against the loading dock of Millennium Tower on December 23rd, counting the 347 in quarters and dimes that represented her entire fortune. Now, as snow began to fall like frozen tears from the Chicago sky, Luna faced the brutal mathematics of street survival. It was December 23rd, every shelter was full, and she had exactly 347 in quarters and dimes. Not enough for a single meal, let alone a warm place to sleep. That's when she saw it. A leather wallet, thick as a paperback novel, lying abandoned on the sidewalk outside the tower's revolving doors. It must have fallen from someone's coat as they rushed through the holiday crowds, and now it sat there like a Christmas miracle wrapped in Italian leather. Luna's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached. The wallet was the kind carried by people who never worried about where their next meal would come from. Soft burgundy leather that probably cost more than most people made in a week. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with hand-stitched seams and a subtle monogram that spoke of old-world luxury. When she opened it, the sight literally made her gasp. Cash, more cash than she'd ever seen in her life. $100 bills layered thick as autumn leaves, followed by credit cards that gleamed like platinum promises. Her hands trembling, Luna counted quickly. $50,000 in crisp hundreds, plus cards from banks she'd only seen in movies. American Express Centurion, JP Morgan Private Bank, Credit Suisse. But it was the driver's license that made her stomach drop to her toes. Marcus Blackstone, age 52, address 875, North Lakeshore Drive, Penthouse. Luna recognized that name. Everyone in Chicago did. Marcus Blackstone, the tech billionaire whose company had revolutionized renewable energy storage, whose net worth had recently crossed the $15 billion mark, according to Forbes. The man whose penthouse apartment was literally visible from where she now sat shivering. His company, Blackstone Energy Solutions, had developed the breakthrough battery technology that was transforming the electric vehicle industry and making renewable energy storage economically viable on a massive scale. Behind the license, she found something that made her hands shake even harder. A folded hospital bracelet with a child's name on it, Emma Blackstone, and a pharmacy receipt for pediatric cancer medication that cost $47,000 per dose. The receipt was from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, dated just 3 days ago, with a note scrawled in desperate handwriting. Emma's treatment must have by Dec 26th. This wasn't just money. This was someone's lifeline. Luna stared at the cash that could change her life forever. $50,000 would mean an apartment, food, safety. It would mean never again falling asleep wondering if she'd freeze before morning. It would mean becoming human again instead of just another invisible ghost haunting Chicago's streets. She could buy a car, get an apartment, enroll in college, start the life she'd been dreaming about since she was old enough to understand that some people had futures while others just had survival. The voice in her head, the survival voice that had kept her alive for 8 brutal months, screamed at her to take it. Rich people have insurance, it whispered. He probably spends more than this on lunch. You need it more than he ever will. This is your chance. This is your ticket out of hell. But another voice, quieter but somehow stronger, echoed something her mother had told her before the cancer had stolen her away. Baby, when you're tempted to take what isn't yours, remember that your character is the only thing they can never take away from you. In this world, you'll face moments where doing the right thing costs you everything. Those are the moments that define who you really are. Luna closed her eyes, the wallet heavy in her hands like a physical manifestation of moral weight. Around her, Chicago hummed with holiday preparations, families hurrying home to warmth and love, office workers celebrating end-of-year bonuses, couples shopping for engagement rings. The city pulsed with the rhythm of lives that had structure, purpose, future, and here she sat, alone with a decision that would define who she was at her core. She thought about Emma Blackstone, a child she'd never met, who might be lying in a hospital bed somewhere fighting for her life. She thought about Marcus Blackstone, a man who could buy and sell entire companies, but who apparently carried cash for his daughter's treatment the same way Luna carried quarters for her next meal. Desperately, protectively, knowing that loss meant catastrophe. She thought about her mother working double shifts at the hospital, always helping others even when her own life was falling apart. Maria Martinez had died with almost nothing to her name, but she died with her integrity intact. Character, she'd always said, is what you do when no one is watching and you have everything to lose. The irony wasn't lost on Luna. Here she was, literally having everything to lose and no one was watching. She made her choice. Standing on legs that shook from cold and hunger, Luna approached the tower's security desk. The guard, a large man whose name tag read Roberto, looked up with the expression people reserved for the homeless, a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed disgust. His eyes swept over her matted hair, her layered clothing, her obvious desperation, and his jaw tightened. "Excuse me," Luna said, her voice cracking from disuse. "I found this outside. It belongs to Marcus Blackstone." Roberto's eyebrows shot up as he examined the wallet. His demeanor shifted immediately from dismissive to shocked. Where exactly did you find this? On the sidewalk by the main entrance. I think it fell out of someone's coat. The guard studied her with new interest, clearly struggling to reconcile the homeless teenager before him with someone returning a wallet full of cash. He opened it, his eyes widening at the sight of the money. Do you know how much is in here? $50,000. Luna said quietly. Roberto stared at her for a long moment. You could have just kept it, he said finally. No one would have known. But it's not mine, Luna replied simply, and someone needs it for something important. Roberto made a phone call, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. Luna caught fragments. Homeless girl. Returned Blackstone's wallet. $50,000 in cash. She's right here. Within minutes, the elevator chimed, and Luna found herself face to face with a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, Mr. Blackstone's personal assistant. You're the one who found Marcus's wallet? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. Her eyes, like Roberto's, swept over Luna's appearance with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been admiration. Luna nodded, holding out the wallet like it was radioactive. Sarah opened it, quickly verifying the contents. Everything's here, she murmured, then looked at Luna with something approaching wonder. Roberto told me that you're homeless. Heat flooded Luna's cheeks. The word always felt like a brand, marking her as different, as failed, as less than human. Yes, ma'am. And you returned a wallet with $50,000 in cash. Yes, ma'am. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Luna's face as if trying to solve a puzzle. How long have you been on the streets? 8 months? And you've been surviving on whatever I can find. Sometimes people give me change. Sometimes restaurants have leftover food. Luna's voice grew smaller with each admission. Sarah's expression softened. When did you last eat? Luna had to think. Yesterday morning. Someone gave me half a sandwich. Jesus, Sarah whispered. Then, louder, Mr. Blackstone is upstairs. He'd like to meet you. The penthouse elevator ride felt like ascending to another planet. Luna caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and wanted to disappear. Her matted hair, her layered thrift store clothes, the smell that no amount of public restroom washing could eliminate. She was about to meet one of the world's wealthiest men, looking like exactly what she was, a homeless kid who hadn't had a real shower in weeks. The elevator climbed for what felt like forever, numbers ticking by on the display, 20, 30, 40, 50. Luna had never been this high in a building before. Through the elevator's glass back wall, she could see the city shrinking below them, the streets where she'd learned to survive becoming a distant grid of light and shadow. When the doors finally opened, Luna stepped directly into an apartment that defied her understanding of what homes could be. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a 360-degree view of Chicago that made the city look like a jeweled circuit board. Art that belonged in museums hung on walls that probably cost more than most houses. A Christmas tree that must have been 20 feet tall dominated one corner, decorated with ornaments that looked like they were made of real gold and silver. But it was the man standing by the windows who captured her attention. Marcus Blackstone looked exactly like his photos, but somehow more human, tall and distinguished, with silver-touched hair and the kind of presence that filled rooms. He was on the phone when the elevator opened, speaking in the rapid-fire language of international business. But he ended the call the moment he saw Luna. "You must be the young woman who found my wallet," he said, approaching with his hand extended. His voice carried traces of an accent she couldn't place. Maybe European, refined, but warm. "I'm Marcus Blackstone." Luna shook his hand, acutely aware of how rough her own palm felt against his. "Yes, sir. I'm Luna Martinez. Please sit," Marcus said, gesturing to a couch that probably cost more than most cars. The leather was butter soft, and Luna sank into it with a sigh she couldn't suppress. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Hot chocolate? When did you last eat?" The kindness in his voice made Luna's throat tighten. "I'm fine, sir." "No, you're not," Marcus said gently. "Sarah, could you ask Maria to prepare something? Soup? Sandwiches, whatever she has ready." He turned back to Luna. "And while we're waiting, I'd like to hear your story." "My story?" Marcus sat across from her, his attention focused entirely on her face. "Luna, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Her heart rate spiked. "Okay. When you found that wallet, you knew there was enough money inside to change your life. You could have disappeared, started over anywhere in the country. No one would have found you. Why did you bring it back?" Luna was quiet for a moment, thinking about her mother, about the choices that define us when no one is watching. "Because it wasn't mine," she said finally, "and because I saw the hospital bracelet. Someone needs that money for something important." Marcus's expression shifted to something Luna couldn't read. "The hospital bracelet." "Yes, sir. And the prescription receipt for cancer medication. I lost my mom to cancer. I know how expensive treatment is." Something in Marcus's face cracked open. He walked to a framed photo on his desk, the same photo Luna had glimpsed in his wallet, and picked it up with hands that trembled slightly. This is my daughter, Emma, he said quietly. She's 8 years old. 6 months ago, she was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. Luna felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years, intellectual excitement. What about mentorship programs, like pairing homeless youth with people who've been through similar experiences? Tell me more about that idea. Well, most mentorship programs pair kids with successful adults who mean well but don't really understand. They give advice like, just work hard or stay positive, without understanding the daily reality of trying to survive on the streets. Luna's voice gained strength as she spoke. But what if we paired kids with people who had been homeless themselves? People who could say, I know this is hard, and here's how I got through it. Marcus was writing notes as fast as he could. That's brilliant. Peer mentorship based on shared experience rather than traditional power dynamics. And what about micro-housing? Luna continued, ideas flowing faster now. I've seen tiny house villages in some cities. They cost a fraction of traditional housing but give people privacy and dignity. You could create transitional communities where kids have their own space but also access to support services. Have you been thinking about these ideas for a while? Luna paused, surprised by the question. I guess I have. When you're living it, you can't help but think about how it could be better. You see all the ways the system fails and you imagine what would actually help. That's exactly what I want to harness, Marcus said. Your insights, your ideas, your understanding of what actually works versus what sounds good in theory. Maria appeared again, this time carrying a small suitcase. I packed some clothes for tonight, she said to Luna. Basic things. Pajamas, toiletries, a change of clothes for tomorrow. We'll get you properly set up tomorrow. Luna stared at the suitcase, overwhelmed. You packed clothes for me? Of course, Mika. You can't go to a hotel with just what you're wearing. The kindness was almost too much. Luna had grown so accustomed to being treated as a problem or a threat that simple human decency felt overwhelming. There's something else, Marcus said. I want you to meet Emma. Luna's heart skipped. Really? She's back in Philadelphia right now, but she's coming to Chicago for Christmas. She specifically asked to meet the girl who found Daddy's wallet. Marcus smiled. I told her about you, and she wants to thank you personally. What did you tell her? The truth. That a very brave young woman found something that belonged to us and brought it back, even though keeping it would have helped her tremendously. Marcus paused. She said she wants to be friends with you. Emma doesn't have many friends right now. The cancer treatment keeps her isolated from other kids. Luna felt tears starting again. I'd love to meet her. Good, because there's something I think you two might have in common. Emma is incredibly smart, but she's also incredibly empathetic. She worries about other kids in the hospital, asks me to donate to children's charities, wants to know how we can help people. Marcus smiled sadly. Cancer has aged her in some ways, made her think about things most 8-year-olds never consider. Like what? Like why some kids have families and others don't. Why some people have enough money for medicine and others don't. She asks very hard questions about fairness and justice. Marcus met Luna's eyes. I think she'd learn a lot from talking to you, and I think you might learn something from her too. Luna nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. There's one more thing, Marcus said, his voice growing serious. This job, this opportunity, is going to be hard work. You'll be dealing with traumatic stories, working with kids who are going through what you went through. You'll be in meetings with government officials and donors who might not immediately take you seriously because of your age or background. I understand. Do you? Because part of what I'm asking you to do is to be the public face of this issue, to share your story, to speak at conferences, to help educate people who've never experienced homelessness about what it's really like. Luna felt a flutter of anxiety. Public speaking? Only when you're ready, and only as much as you're comfortable with. But yes, eventually I'd like you to help us educate others. Your story is powerful, and it could help change how people think about homeless youth. Luna thought about all the times she'd been made to feel ashamed of her situation, all the looks of disgust and fear she'd endured. The idea of standing up and owning her story instead of hiding from it was both terrifying and exhilarating. What if people judge me? What if they think I'm just some trashy kid who got lucky? Then they'll be wrong, Marcus said firmly. And part of your job will be helping them understand why they're wrong. He paused. Luna, I've met presidents and CEOs and Nobel Prize winners. I've never met anyone who demonstrated the kind of moral courage you showed tonight. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Sarah reappeared in the penthouse. The suite is ready at the Fairmont. I've arranged for a car to take Luna there whenever she's ready. Marcus looked at Luna. Are you ready? Or do you have more questions? Luna looked around the penthouse one more time, trying to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, she'd been counting quarters and preparing to spend another night on the streets. Now she was being offered a job, an apartment, a future she'd never dared to imagine. I have one more question, she said. What's that? When do I sign? Marcus laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the room. Right now, if you want to. He produced a pen, and Luna signed her name at the bottom of the contract, with hands that shook only slightly. When she was done, Marcus signed as well, then handed her a copy. Welcome to the Blackstone Foundation, Luna Martinez, Director of Youth Advocacy and Program Development. Luna stared at the paper with her name on it, proof that this was really happening. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing, for believing." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for showing me what integrity looks like, for reminding me why this work matters." As Luna prepared to leave for the hotel, Maria pressed a small bag into her hands. "Leftovers," she explained, "in case you get hungry later." The gesture was so maternal, so normal, that Luna almost broke down again. It had been nearly a year since anyone had worried about whether she'd eaten enough. On the elevator ride down, Sarah explained the logistics of the next few days. "Tomorrow we'll get you set up with everything you need. Sunday, we'll start your orientation. Monday, you begin work." She paused. "Luna, I want you to know something. I've worked for Marcus for 8 years. I've seen him make a lot of decisions, hire a lot of people. I've never seen him more certain about anything than he is about you." "Really?" "Really. He called me 20 minutes after you left the wallet and said, 'Sarah, I just met the person who's going to help us change everything.'" The car ride to the hotel passed in a blur. Luna pressed her face to the window, watching the city she'd learned to survive in transform from a hostile environment into a place of possibility. The same streets that had been cold and dangerous just hours ago now felt different, infused with hope. The Fairmont suite was larger than any apartment Luna had ever lived in, with a king-sized bed, a sitting area, and a view of Lake Michigan. The bathroom alone was bigger than some of the foster homes she'd stayed in. Luna ran a bath, the first real bath she'd had in months, and sank into the warm water with a sigh that seemed to release 8 months of tension. She thought about her mother, about what Maria would say if she could see her now. Character is what you do when no one is watching and you have everything to lose. Luna had made her choice in that moment of absolute desperation, and somehow, impossibly, it had led her here, to this bathroom, this job, this future that stretched out before her like an uncharted continent. She thought about Emma Blackstone fighting for her life in a hospital bed and felt a surge of protective determination. She thought about all the other kids sleeping in loading docks and abandoned buildings tonight and made a silent promise to them and to herself. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. 3 months later, Luna stood in the renovated community center that had become the headquarters of the Blackstone Youth Initiative, watching a group of formerly homeless teenagers learn job skills that would change their lives forever. Her apartment, a real apartment with heat and a door that locked, was 5 blocks away. Her college courses were going well, and for the first time in her life, she had a savings account. But the moment that stayed with her wasn't any of those victories. It was the night she'd stood in the snow, holding a stranger's wallet, and chosen honesty over survival. The program had already helped 200 young people find stable housing and employment. Luna had testified before Congress about the failures of the foster care system. She'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of their young leaders of tomorrow. But none of that compared to the letters she received from kids who'd found hope through the programs she'd helped design. Emma Blackstone was in remission, her cancer responding better than anyone had dared hope. She and Luna had become unlikely best friends, the 8-year-old and the 18-year-old, bonding over shared experiences of loss and resilience. Emma had even helped design some of the Foundation's programs, her childlike wisdom cutting through adult complexities to find simple, powerful solutions. The night before Emma's last treatment, she'd called Luna with a request that had brought tears to both their eyes. "Luna," Emma had said, her voice small but determined, "when I'm all better, I want to help other kids like you helped me. I want to make sure no kid ever has to sleep outside in the cold." "You already are helping," Luna had replied. "Every day you're helping." The foundation had expanded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. What had started as a local Chicago initiative now operated in 37 cities across the United States and was being studied as a model by governments around the world. The key difference was that it was designed and led by people who had lived the experiences they were trying to address. Luna's office was filled with photos and letters from young people whose lives had been transformed. But her favorite was a simple note from a 17-year-old named David who had aged out of foster care in Detroit. "Dear Luna, I was sleeping in my car when I heard about your program. I thought it was too good to be true. 3 months later, I have an apartment, a job, and I'm starting college in the fall. But most importantly, I have hope again. You showed me that my story doesn't end with being homeless. It begins with what I choose to do next. Thank you for proving that integrity isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of everything worth building." That choice had saved a little girl's life. That choice had created a program that would help thousands of young people find their way out of homelessness. That choice had proven that character isn't built by circumstances. It's revealed by them. 6 months later, Luna received a wedding invitation that made her cry happy tears. Marcus Blackstone was marrying his longtime partner, Dr. Catherine Williams, the woman who had been pregnant with Emma during that fateful car accident 22 years ago. Emma, now in full remission and glowing with health, was going to be the flower girl. At the wedding, as Luna watched Emma dance with her father, she thought about the ripple effects of integrity. How one decision to do the right thing could cascade into countless lives saved, dreams restored, futures made possible. But the moment that changed everything happened during the reception, when Marcus stood to give a toast. 22 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the crowded ballroom, a homeless veteran named James saved my family's life. I never found James, never got to thank him properly. But 8 months ago, a homeless teenager named Luna Martinez showed me how to honor his memory. He gestured to Luna, who felt her cheeks burn as hundreds of eyes turned to her. Luna found my wallet containing $50,000, money I desperately needed for Emma's cancer treatment. She was starving, freezing, had every reason to keep it. Instead, she brought it back because she saw a hospital bracelet and knew someone needed it more than she did. The room was completely silent now. That act of integrity didn't just save Emma's life. It sparked something bigger. The Blackstone Youth Initiative has now helped over 5,000 young people transition out of homelessness. We've changed policy in 37 cities. We've proven that when we see homeless youth as resources rather than problems, miracles happen. Marcus paused, his voice thick with emotion. But the real miracle is what Luna taught me that night. She showed me that heroism isn't about having money or power. It's about making the right choice when everything is pushing you toward the wrong one. She showed me that character isn't built by circumstances. It's revealed by them. He raised his glass. So tonight, I want to toast not just Catherine and Emma and our family's future, but Luna Martinez and the thousands of young people who refuse to let their circumstances define them. To James, wherever you are, and to the truth that sometimes returning what isn't yours is the only way to find what is. As the room erupted in applause, Luna felt a hand slip into hers. Emma was beside her, beaming with pride. "You know what I realized?" Emma whispered. "What's that?" "You didn't just save my life that night. You saved your own life too. You just didn't know it yet." Her mother had been right. Character was the one thing they could never take away from her. But what Luna learned that night was even more powerful. Character wasn't just something you kept. It was something you gave away, and in giving it away, you got back everything you'd ever truly needed. 1 year later, the moment that completed the circle happened on a snowy December evening. Exactly 1 year after Luna had found the wallet. She was leaving the community center when she saw a homeless teenager huddled in the same loading dock where she'd once slept. Without hesitation, Luna approached the girl and said the words that had once changed her life. "There's a warm place inside and people who want to help. Will you let me show you the way?" The girl looked up with hollow eyes that Luna recognized, the look of someone who'd given up on the world caring about her survival. "Why would you help me?" the girl asked. Luna smiled, thinking of a wallet full of cash, a little girl dancing at her father's wedding, and the infinite power of choosing hope over despair. "Because someone once helped me," she said simply, "and because that's what we do." The girl's name was Sarah, and she was 16, had aged out of care early due to overcrowding, and had been on the streets for 4 months. As Luna walked her into the warm community center, she felt the profound satisfaction of a cycle completing itself. That night, as Luna helped Sarah fill out intake forms and connect with housing services, she realized something profound. Her story hadn't ended with that moment of choice in the snow. It had begun there. Every life she helped transform was another thread in a tapestry that had started with one simple decision: to do the right thing when everything was pushing her toward the wrong thing. 6 months later, Sarah would become the second director of youth advocacy at the Blackstone Foundation's Detroit branch, her own lived experience informing programs that would help hundreds more young people. The cycle continued, integrity begetting integrity, hope creating hope, character revealing itself in the most desperate moments, and transforming not just individual lives but entire communities. Sometimes the smallest acts of honesty create the largest waves of change, and sometimes returning what isn't yours is the only way to find what is. In the end, Luna's mother had been right about character being the one thing that could never be taken away. But what Maria Martinez couldn't have known, what no one could have predicted, was that giving away your character when it cost you everything is how you discover that you never truly lose it. You just invest it in a future bigger than you ever dared to imagine. The end. Like the air had been sucked from the room. That medication you saw on the receipt, it's experimental, not covered by insurance. It costs $47,000 per dose, and she needs it every 2 weeks. Marcus's voice grew thick. That wallet contained exactly enough cash for her next treatment, plus a little extra for whatever might come next. "Oh my God," Luna whispered. "The treatment has to be paid for in cash, in advance. The pharmaceutical company doesn't accept insurance or payment plans for experimental drugs. If you had kept that money, my daughter might have—" Marcus stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He set the photo down and looked at Luna with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't just return a wallet, Luna. You may have saved my daughter's life." The weight of what she'd almost done, what she could have stolen without knowing, hit Luna like a physical blow. "I didn't know," she gasped. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how important. Don't apologize, Marcus said firmly. You made the right choice without knowing the consequences. That's the definition of true character. He paused, studying her face. Tell me about your mother. Luna's throat constricted. Nobody ever asked about her mother anymore. She was a nurse at Chicago General. She used to say that healing people was her calling, that she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The words came slowly at first, then faster. When she got sick, she kept working as long as she could. Even when the chemo made her so tired she could barely stand, she'd drag herself to the hospital because she said her patients needed her. What kind of cancer? Pancreatic, stage 4 by the time they found it. Luna's voice dropped to a whisper. The doctor said she had maybe 6 months. She made it 11. She was the strongest person I ever knew. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. She always told me that our circumstances don't define us. Our choices do. She said that even when everything is falling apart, we still get to choose who we want to be. Luna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I think about that a lot when things get really bad, and that's why you returned to the wallet. I guess. I kept thinking about what my mom would do, and I knew she'd never be able to live with herself if she took money that belonged to someone else, especially money for a sick child. At that moment, a woman in her 50s appeared, carrying a tray laden with food. She was small and compact, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Luna, this is Maria Gonzalez, who keeps this household running, Marcus said. Maria, this is the young woman I told you about. Maria set the tray down and took Luna's hands in hers. Mija, she said softly, when Mr. Marcus told me what you did, I started crying. You are a very special girl. The tray contained more food than Luna had seen in months. Homemade chicken soup that smelled like heaven, thick sandwiches cut into triangles, fresh fruit, cookies that were still warm from the oven. Luna's stomach growled so loudly that everyone could hear it. Please eat, Marcus said. We can talk while you have something. Luna picked up the soup spoon with shaking hands. The first sip was like a religious experience, rich, warm, seasoned with love and care. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to not wolf down everything on the tray like the starving person she was. Luna, Marcus said gently, I want to understand your situation better. You said you aged out of foster care 8 months ago? Luna nodded, swallowing a bite of sandwich. On my 18th birthday. Well, technically 3 days after, but close enough. And since then, you've been on the streets? Mostly, I was in a youth shelter for a while, but they have time limits. I had a job for a few weeks, but she explained about the address requirements, the impossible catch-22 of needing a home to get work, and needing work to get a home. Marcus listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Luna found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about the foster families who'd treated her like free labor, about the social workers who saw her as just another case file, about the nights when she'd been so cold and scared that she'd considered doing things she'd never imagined just to survive. The hardest part, she said finally, isn't the cold or the hunger. It's being invisible. People look right through you like you don't exist. Or worse, they look at you like you're something dirty that needs to be swept away. But you exist, Marcus said quietly. You matter. What you did tonight proves that. Luna felt tears threatening again. Sometimes I wonder if this is just my life now. If I'm going to be one of those people you see on the streets for years, just existing. No, Marcus said with quiet certainty. That's not going to happen. Not to you. He moved to his desk and pulled out a folder. Luna, I want to tell you something. For the past 2 years, my company has been developing a program for young people aging out of foster care. We've been researching the problem, consulting with experts, designing services, but we've been missing something crucial, the voice of someone who's actually lived through it. He slid the folder across to her. I'd like to offer you a position with our foundation, Director of Youth Advocacy and Program Development. Your job would be to help us design and implement programs that actually work, because you'd know what these kids really need. Luna opened the folder with trembling hands. The first page showed a salary figure that made her gasp. $75,000 per year, more money than she'd dreamed of earning in her entire life. But I don't have any experience, she whispered. I don't have a college degree or qualifications, or you have something more valuable than all of that, Marcus interrupted. You have lived experience, moral courage, and the empathy that comes from real suffering. You understand these kids in a way that no consultant or social worker ever could. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Luna, I don't need another expert who can write reports about youth homelessness. I need someone who can look at scared kids and show them that integrity isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of everything worth building. I need someone who can prove that character matters more than circumstances. Luna stared at the papers through her tears. The package included not just the salary, but health insurance, a housing allowance, and a full college scholarship fund. I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then walked to another framed photo on his desk. This one showed a much younger Marcus with a beautiful woman and a toddler. 22 years ago, he said quietly, my wife Catherine was pregnant with Emma. We were driving to a dinner party when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit us. Our car flipped 3 times and caught fire. Luna held her breath. I was unconscious. Catherine was trapped. The fire was spreading and she couldn't get out. Marcus's voice grew thick. A homeless veteran named James pulled us both from the wreckage and stayed with us until the ambulance came. He saved all 3 of our lives. Mine, Catherine's, and Emma's. What happened to him? That's just it. By the time I was released from the hospital, he'd disappeared. I hired private investigators, offered rewards, spent years trying to find him, but he'd vanished into the same invisible world you've been living in. Marcus paused, his voice breaking slightly. James saved my family, and I never got to properly thank him. I never got to help him the way he helped us. Luna felt the pieces clicking together. And tonight you showed me what James might have been like. You showed me that heroism isn't about having money or power or status. It's about making the right choice when everything is pushing you toward the wrong one. Marcus met her eyes. I can't repay James for what he did, but I can honor his memory by helping you, by creating something that ensures no other kid has to choose between survival and integrity the way you did tonight. Luna wiped her eyes with the napkin Maria had provided. What would I actually do? Day to day. First, you'd work with our team to design housing programs that actually meet young people where they are. Most transitional housing programs fail because they're designed by people who've never been homeless. They have rules and requirements that sound reasonable in a conference room, but are impossible in real life. Marcus began pacing, his energy building as he spoke. You'd help us create job training programs that don't just teach skills, but teach them to kids who might not have reliable transportation, or professional clothes, or stable housing. You'd work with colleges to develop pathways for students who don't fit the traditional mold. But most importantly, he continued, you'd be the voice in the room when we're making decisions. When someone proposes a policy that sounds good but won't work in practice, you'd be there to say, wait, here's what this actually looks like for a kid sleeping in a car. Luna felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that extended beyond just surviving the next day. There's something else, Marcus said. Emma is in treatment at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. It's one of the best pediatric cancer centers in the world, but it means I travel back and forth constantly. I'd want you to come with me sometimes to visit other cities, see how different places handle youth homelessness. You want me to travel? Like, on airplanes? Marcus smiled. Private jet, actually. One of the few perks of this level of wealth. His expression grew serious again. Luna, I want you to see that there's a whole world out there beyond survival. I want you to meet other young people who've overcome impossible circumstances. I want you to understand that your story doesn't end with homelessness. It begins with what you choose to do next. Luna looked around the penthouse, at the art and the view and the Christmas tree that probably cost more than most people's cars, and tried to imagine herself belonging in this world. It seemed impossible, like trying to picture herself on the moon. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I'm not smart enough? What if I mess up? What if people find out I don't really belong here? Belong here? Marcus sat back down across from her. Luna, you just demonstrated more moral courage than most people show in their entire lives. You're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. He paused. And as for being smart enough, did you know that some of the most successful people I know never finished high school? Intelligence isn't about degrees or test scores. It's about curiosity, empathy, and the ability to learn. You have all of that in abundance. Maria had quietly returned and was refilling Luna's cup with hot chocolate. Mr. Marcus is right, she said softly. I have worked for many wealthy families. Most of them are good people, but they live in bubbles. They don't understand how the world works for people like us. You would help them see. And the college part? Luna asked. I barely finished high school. I had to keep switching schools because of foster placements. We'll start slowly, Marcus said. Night classes, online courses, whatever works with your schedule. The foundation will pay for everything, and you can take as long as you need. Education isn't a race. Luna felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. Can I ask, why me specifically? There are other homeless kids who probably deserve this more. Deserve? Marcus shook his head. Luna, this isn't about deserving. This is about recognizing that you've already proven who you are. Tonight, when you were cold and hungry and desperate, you chose honesty over personal gain. You chose to protect a child you'd never met over saving yourself. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Do you know what most people would have done with that wallet? Kept it, Luna said quietly. Exactly. Not because they're bad people, but because survival is a powerful motivator. What you did tonight is extraordinary, and it tells me everything I need to know about your character. Marcus turned back to her. But there's something else. Earlier you said the hardest part of being homeless is being invisible. I want to change that. I want to create programs that see homeless young people as resources rather than problems. I want to build something that recognizes that you don't need to be saved. You need to be supported in saving yourselves. Luna felt tears starting again. This is really real? This isn't some kind of test or dream? It's real, Marcus said gently. But I need you to know that this isn't charity. This is a job offer. I'm not offering to help you out of pity. I'm offering you this position because I believe you're the right person for it, because my foundation needs what you have to offer. Luna stared at the contract, the numbers and words blurring through her tears. What happens next? I mean, if I say yes? First, we get you set up with temporary housing. There's a corporate apartment downtown that we use for visiting executives. You can stay there while we find you something permanent. Marcus pulled out his phone. Sarah, could you call the Fairmont and book the executive suite for indefinitely? Yes, I know it's expensive. Yes, I'm sure. He hung up and smiled at Luna's shocked expression. Tomorrow, we'll take you shopping for professional clothes, get you a phone, open bank accounts. Monday, you start work. We'll begin slowly. Meetings with our program coordinators, visits to existing youth services, research. You'll basically be doing a paid internship in your own expertise. My own expertise? Luna repeated, testing how the words felt. Exactly. You're the expert on what it's like to be a teenager with no safety net. That's incredibly valuable knowledge. Marcus sat back down. Luna, I want to tell you about something I learned from James, the man who saved my family. What did you learn? James could have just called 911 and left. The fire department would have eventually gotten to us. But he didn't. He stayed. He held Catherine's hand while she was trapped, told her jokes to keep her calm, promised her that everything would be okay. Even after the ambulance came, he stayed until he knew we were safe. Marcus's voice grew soft. Later, the paramedics told me that James had burns on his hands and arms from pulling us out of the car. He never mentioned it, never complained. He just cared for strangers because it was the right thing to do. He sounds like an incredible person. He was. And that's what I see in you. You didn't just return the wallet. You could have mailed it or dropped it at a police station, but you brought it back personally because you were worried about Emma, about whether she'd get her medication in time. Luna thought about that moment in the snow, the weight of the wallet in her hands, the image of a sick child that had driven her decision. I kept thinking about how scared her parents must be. Exactly. Empathy in action. That's what James showed us, and that's what you showed me tonight. Marcus leaned forward. I want to tell you something else. This foundation we're creating, it's not going to be just another charity that throws money at problems. It's going to be different because you're going to help design it. How? We're going to start by listening. Really listening. Not just to service providers and government officials, but to the young people themselves. You're going to help us conduct interviews, focus groups, surveys. We're going to find out what kids actually need, not what we think they need. Marcus pulled out another folder. I've been researching this issue for 2 years, and the statistics are heartbreaking. Did you know that 40% of homeless youth have been in foster care? That LGBTQ+ youth make up 40% of the homeless youth population, despite being only 7% of the general youth population? Luna nodded. I know kids from both groups. The system isn't set up for anyone who doesn't fit a narrow definition of normal. Exactly. And most programs fail because they're designed by people who've never experienced homelessness. They create rules that sound reasonable but are impossible to follow if you're actually living on the streets. Like requiring a permanent address to get services, Luna said bitterly, or having meetings during business hours when you're trying to work, or mandatory counseling sessions that assume your homelessness is caused by personal problems instead of systemic failures. Yes, see, this is exactly what I mean. You understand the practical realities in a way that no amount of research can teach. Marcus's excitement was palpable. I want you to help us design programs that actually work, housing that doesn't come with impossible requirements, job training that recognizes that homeless youth might not have professional clothes or reliable transportation, education programs that work around the chaos of unstable housing. Luna felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years, intellectual excitement. What about mentorship programs, like pairing homeless youth with people who've been through similar experiences? Tell me more about that idea. Well, most mentorship programs pair kids with successful adults who mean well but don't really understand. They give advice like just work hard or stay positive without understanding the daily reality of trying to survive on the streets. Luna's voice gained strength as she spoke. But what if we paired kids with people who had been homeless themselves? People who could say, I know this is hard, and here's how I got through it. Marcus was writing notes as fast as he could. That's brilliant. Peer mentorship based on shared experience rather than traditional power dynamics. And what about microhousing? Luna continued. Ideas flowing faster now. I've seen tiny house villages in some cities. They cost a fraction of traditional housing, but give people privacy and dignity. You could create transitional communities where kids have their own space, but also access to support services. Have you been thinking about these ideas for a while? Luna paused, surprised by the question. I guess I have. When you're living it, you can't help but think about how it could be better. You see all the ways the system fails, and you imagine what would actually help. That's exactly what I want to harness, Marcus said. Your insights, your ideas, your understanding of what actually works versus what sounds good in theory. Maria appeared again, this time carrying a small suitcase. I packed some clothes for tonight, she said to Luna. Basic things. Pajamas, toiletries, a change of clothes for tomorrow. We'll get you properly set up tomorrow. Luna stared at the suitcase, overwhelmed. You packed clothes for me? Of course, mija. You can't go to a hotel with just what you're wearing. The kindness was almost too much. Luna had grown so accustomed to being treated as a problem or a threat that simple human decency felt overwhelming. There's something else, Marcus said. I want you to meet Emma. Luna's heart skipped. Really? She's back in Philadelphia right now, but she's coming to Chicago for Christmas. She specifically asked to meet the girl who found Daddy's wallet. Marcus smiled. I told her about you and she wants to thank you personally. What did you tell her? The truth. That a very brave young woman found something that belonged to us and brought it back. Even though keeping it would have helped her tremendously. Marcus paused. She said she wants to be friends with you. Emma doesn't have many friends right now. The cancer treatment keeps her isolated from other kids. Luna felt tears starting again. I'd love to meet her. Good, because there's something I think you two might have in common. Emma is incredibly smart, but she's also incredibly empathetic. She worries about other kids in the hospital, asks me to donate to children's charities, wants to know how we can help people. Marcus smiled sadly. Cancer has aged her in some ways, made her think about things most 8-year-olds never consider. Like what? Like why some kids have families and others don't. Why some people have enough money for medicine and others don't. She asked very hard questions about fairness and justice. Marcus met Luna's eyes. I think she'd learn a lot from talking to you, and I think you might learn something from her too. Luna nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. There's one more thing, Marcus said, his voice growing serious. This job, this opportunity, it's going to be hard work. You'll be dealing with traumatic stories, working with kids who are going through what you went through. You'll be in meetings with government officials and donors who might not immediately take you seriously because of your age or background. I understand. Do you? Because part of what I'm asking you to do is to be the public face of this issue, to share your story, to speak at conferences, to help educate people who've never experienced homelessness about what it's really like. Luna felt a flutter of anxiety. Public speaking? Only when you're ready, and only as much as you're comfortable with. But yes, eventually, I'd like you to help us educate others. Your story is powerful, and it could help change how people think about homeless youth. Luna thought about all the times she'd been made to feel ashamed of her situation, all the looks of disgust and fear she'd endured. The idea of standing up and owning her story instead of hiding from it was both terrifying and exhilarating. What if people judge me? What if they think I'm just some trashy kid who got lucky? Then they'll be wrong, Marcus said firmly. And part of your job will be helping them understand why they're wrong. He paused. Luna, I've met presidents and CEOs and Nobel Prize winners. I've never met anyone who demonstrated the kind of moral courage you showed tonight. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Sarah reappeared in the penthouse. The suite is ready at the Fairmont. I've arranged for a car to take Luna there whenever she's ready. Marcus looked at Luna. Are you ready, or do you have more questions? Luna looked around the penthouse one more time, trying to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, she'd been counting quarters and preparing to spend another night on the streets. Now she was being offered a job, an apartment, a future she'd never dared to imagine. I have one more question, she said. What's that? When do I sign? Marcus laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the room. Right now, if you want to. He produced a pen, and Luna signed her name at the bottom of the contract, with hands that shook only slightly. When she was done, Marcus signed as well, then handed her a copy. Welcome to the Blackstone Foundation, Luna Martinez, Director of Youth Advocacy and Program Development. Luna stared at the paper with her name on it, proof that this was really happening. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing it, for believing. Thank you, Marcus replied, for showing me what integrity looks like, for reminding me why this work matters. As Luna prepared to leave for the hotel, Maria pressed a small bag into her hands. Leftovers, she explained, in case you get hungry later. The gesture was so maternal, so normal, that Luna almost broke down again. It had been nearly a year since anyone had worried about whether she'd eaten enough. On the elevator ride down, Sarah explained the logistics of the next few days. Tomorrow, we'll get you set up with everything you need. Sunday, we'll start your orientation. Monday, you begin work. She paused. Luna, I want you to know something. I've worked for Marcus for 8 years. I've seen him make a lot of decisions, hire a lot of people. I've never seen him more certain about anything than he is about you. Really? Really. He called me 20 minutes after you left the wallet and said, Sarah, I just met the person who's going to help us change everything. The car ride to the hotel passed in a blur. Luna pressed her face to the window, watching the city she'd learned to survive and transform from a hostile environment into a place of possibility. The same streets that had been cold and dangerous just hours ago now felt different, infused with hope. The Fairmont suite was larger than any apartment Luna had ever lived in, with a king-sized bed, a sitting area, and a view of Lake Michigan. The bathroom alone was bigger than some of the foster homes she'd stayed in. Luna ran a bath, the first real bath she'd had in months, and sank into the warm water with a sigh that seemed to release 8 months of tension. She thought about her mother, about what Maria would say if she could see her now. Character is what you do when no one is watching. and you have everything to lose. Luna had made her choice in that moment of absolute desperation, and somehow, impossibly, it had led her here. To this bathroom, this job, this future that stretched out before her like an uncharted continent. She thought about Emma Blackstone fighting for her life in a hospital bed and felt a surge of protective determination. She thought about all the other kids sleeping in loading docks and abandoned buildings tonight and made a silent promise to them and to herself. Tomorrow the real work would begin, and distinguished, with silver-touched hair and the kind of presence that filled rooms. He was on the phone when the elevator opened, speaking in the rapid-fire language of international business, but he ended the call the moment he saw Luna. "You must be the young woman who found my wallet," he said, approaching with his hand extended. His voice carried traces of an accent she couldn't place, maybe European, refined, but warm. "I'm Marcus Blackstone." Luna shook his hand, acutely aware of how rough her own palm felt against his. "Yes, sir. I'm Luna Martinez." "Please sit," Marcus said, gesturing to a couch that probably cost more than most cars. The leather was butter soft, and Luna sank into it with a sigh she couldn't suppress. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Hot chocolate? When did you last eat?" The kindness in his voice made Luna's throat tighten. "I'm fine, sir." "No, you're not," Marcus said gently. "Sarah, could you ask Maria to prepare something? Soup? Sandwiches? Whatever she has ready." He turned back to Luna. "And while we're waiting, I'd like to hear your story." "My story?" Marcus sat across from her, his attention focused entirely on her face. "Luna, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Her heart rate spiked. "Okay. When you found that wallet, you knew there was enough money inside to change your life. You could have disappeared, started over anywhere in the country. No one would have found you. Why did you bring it back?" Luna was quiet for a moment, thinking about her mother, about the choices that define us when no one is watching. "Because it wasn't mine," she said finally. "And because I saw the hospital bracelet. Someone needs that money for something important." Marcus's expression shifted to something Luna couldn't read. "The hospital bracelet. Yes, sir. And the prescription receipt for cancer medication. I lost my mom to cancer. I know how expensive treatment is." Something in Marcus's face cracked open. He walked to a framed photo on his desk, the same photo Luna had glimpsed in his wallet, and picked it up with hands that trembled slightly. "This is my daughter, Emma," he said quietly. "She's 8 years old. 6 months ago, she was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia." Luna felt like the air had been sucked from the room. "That medication you saw on the receipt, it's experimental, not covered by insurance. It costs $47,000 per dose, and she needs it every 2 weeks." Marcus's voice grew thick. That wallet contained exactly enough cash for her next treatment, plus a little extra for whatever might come next. "Oh my God," Luna whispered. "The treatment has to be paid for in cash, in advance. The pharmaceutical company doesn't accept insurance or payment plans for experimental drugs. If you had kept that money, my daughter might have—" Marcus stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He set the photo down and looked at Luna with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't just return a wallet, Luna. You may have saved my daughter's life. At that moment, I need to check my word count to ensure I'm on track for 9,000 words. A billionaire discovers maid was secretly his sister. Edward Grant thought he was hiring just another cleaning lady, change everything about his broken family. His 9-year-old son, Noah, hadn't spoken or moved since a terrible accident. The best doctors in the world said there was no hope. But when Edward came home early one day, he discovered Rosa doing something that should have been impossible. She was dancing with his paralyzed son, and Noah was dancing back. What happened next uncovered a family secret that had been buried for 30 years. The woman who could mysteriously heal his unreachable child wasn't a stranger at all. Hidden letters would reveal a truth so shocking, it would rewrite everything Edward thought he knew about his family. Stay with us to discover how a simple cleaning job became the key to unlocking decades of buried connections. You'll witness the moment when impossible movement returned to a silent child, learn why some healing can't be found in hospitals, and uncover the stunning revelation that proves sometimes the people we need most find us in the most unexpected ways. Because this isn't just about a maid who broke the rules. It's about family secrets, medical miracles, and the power of human connection to heal what everyone said was permanently broken. The truth waiting in this story will leave you questioning everything you believe about coincidence, family, and the invisible forces that guide us toward exactly who we're meant to find. This isn't just a story about a billionaire and his maid. It's about the mysterious forces that pull broken souls together across bloodlines, social barriers, and the devastating silence that follows tragedy. It's about a woman whose gentle rebellion against protocol awakened not just a paralyzed boy, but the buried humanity in his father. And most shocking of all, it's about a family secret so profound that when the truth finally emerged from a forgotten envelope in a dusty storage room, it revealed that sometimes fate doesn't just bring strangers together, it brings family home. Stay with us, because what begins as a simple moment of unexpected movement becomes a journey through grief, healing, and the discovery that the most powerful medicine isn't found in hospitals or laboratories. It's found in the courage to dance when the world tells you to sit still, to sing when silence seems safer, and to love when love feels like the most dangerous risk of all. And waiting at the heart of this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about coincidence, connection, and the invisible threads that bind us to the people we're meant to find. Edward Grant's penthouse felt more like a mausoleum than a home. 57 floors above Manhattan's restless energy, the immaculate space stretched out in clinical perfection, marble floors that reflected nothing, furniture positioned with mathematical precision, and air so still it seemed afraid to circulate. Every surface gleamed with the kind of sterile brilliance that screamed of professional maintenance and emotional abandonment. At 38, Edward had built Grant Technologies, from a college dorm room idea into a global empire worth $12 billion. He could move markets with a phone call, reshape industries with a decision, and command the attention of world leaders with a simple request for a meeting. But none of that power, none of that influence, could penetrate the silence that had consumed his home for the past 3 years. The silence had a name. Noah Grant, age 9, who sat motionless in his wheelchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows each day, staring out at a city that pulsed with life while he remained trapped in a prison of his own making. The spinal injury from the car accident that had killed his mother, Lillian, had left him paralyzed from the waist down. But what truly terrified Edward wasn't the wheelchair or the medical equipment or even the army of specialists who filed through their home with clipboards and concerned expressions. It was the absence behind his son's pale blue eyes. Not grief. Grief would have been understandable, even workable. Not anger. Anger could be channeled, processed, healed. What lived in Noah's gaze was something far more devastating, a complete retreat from existence itself. The boy who had once filled these rooms with laughter and chaos and the beautiful mess of childhood had simply disappeared. His body remained, breathing and blinking and going through the mechanical motions of survival. But Noah, the essential spark that made him who he was, had evacuated so thoroughly that sometimes Edward wondered if his son had died in that car, along with his mother. The medical bills could have bankrupted a small nation. Edward had spared no expense, flying in specialists from Switzerland, Japan, and South Africa. He'd funded experimental neurological programs, invested millions in cutting-edge virtual reality therapy systems, and transformed an entire floor of their building into a private medical facility that rivaled the best children's hospitals in the world. Physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, art therapists, music therapists, they came and went like a revolving door of hope and disappointment. Each one arrived with confidence and credentials, armed with techniques that had worked miraculous breakthroughs with other children. Each one left 3 to 6 months later with the same bewildered expression and the same gentle recommendation. Perhaps it was time to consider that Noah might simply need more time. Years, perhaps, maybe a lifetime. But Edward refused to accept that verdict. He approached his son's condition the same way he approached every business challenge, with relentless research, unlimited resources, and the absolute conviction that every problem had a solution if you were smart enough and determined enough to find it. He read every study published on pediatric trauma recovery, consulted with neurologists in 12 countries, and funded research into experimental treatments that existed only in theoretical papers. What he couldn't understand, what no amount of money or expertise could explain, was why Noah would sometimes track movement with his eyes for a few seconds, or why his fingers would occasionally twitch in what might have been an attempt to reach for something, only to retreat back into stillness the moment anyone noticed. These tiny flickers of engagement were more tormenting than complete absence would have been, because they suggested that somewhere inside that silent shell, his son was still there, choosing not to emerge. The penthouse staff moved through their daily routines with the hushed efficiency of funeral directors. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had worked for the family since before Noah was born, spoke in whispers and avoided eye contact whenever she entered Noah's room. James, the personal chef, prepared elaborate meals that went untouched, replacing them 3 times a day with the mechanical persistence of someone who had long since stopped hoping for appreciation. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Noah's full-time nurse, monitored his physical condition with clinical precision while carefully avoiding any conversation about emotional progress. And then there was Rosa. Miles had been working as part of the cleaning crew for exactly 43 days when everything changed. She was 28 years old, though she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that life required both resilience and grace. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her uniform was always spotless, and her movements through the penthouse were so unobtrusive that most days Edward forgot she was there at all. Unlike the other staff members, Rosa didn't treat the penthouse like a shrine to tragedy. She cleaned around Noah's wheelchair without the theatrical tiptoe that everyone else employed. She hummed softly while she worked, barely audible melodies in what sounded like Portuguese or Spanish, though Edward had never bothered to ask. She never tried to engage Noah directly, never spoke to him in the artificially cheerful tone that therapists used, never made the mistake of treating him like an invalid who needed to be handled with exaggerated care. In fact, if Edward had been pressed to describe Rosa's presence in their home, he might have said she was almost invisible, which was exactly why what happened on that Tuesday morning in October was so completely impossible to explain. Edward's day had begun like every other day for the past 3 years. He woke at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of his phone's alarm, checked overnight emails from his Tokyo and London offices, and spent an hour reviewing market reports while his personal trainer waited in the penthouse gym. By 7 a.m., he was showered, dressed, and reviewing the day's schedule over coffee that he never actually tasted, his mind already moving through the series of meetings, decisions, and negotiations that would fill the next 12 hours. He paused outside Noah's room as he did every morning, listening for any sound that might suggest his son was awake. The silence that greeted him was familiar, but no less devastating for its predictability. He pushed the door open quietly, expecting to see Noah in his usual position by the window, staring out at the city with the blank expression that had become his default setting. Instead, he saw the untouched breakfast tray sitting on the side table where Dr. Hendricks had left it the night before. Noah hadn't eaten anything substantial in weeks, surviving on protein shakes and the occasional piece of fruit that could be coaxed into him with tremendous effort. Edward made a mental note to call the nutritionist again, though he already knew what she would say. They couldn't force him to eat, and until his emotional state improved, his appetite would remain essentially non-existent. The board meeting that morning was supposed to be routine: quarterly reports, budget approvals, and a presentation on their expansion into Southeast Asian markets. Edward sat at the head of the polished conference table in Grant Technologies' Manhattan headquarters, listening to his CFO explain profit margins and market projections with the same engagement he might have shown for a grocery list. His mind kept drifting back to Noah's breakfast tray, to the way his son's shoulders had looked so small and fragile in the oversized wheelchair, to the growing fear that they were losing him one silent day at a time. Then his assistant knocked and entered with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Grant, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just received word that the Singapore delegation had to reschedule. Their flight was delayed by mechanical issues, and they won't arrive until Thursday." Edward stared at her for a moment, his mind struggling to process the information. The Singapore meeting was supposed to be the centerpiece of his afternoon, a crucial negotiation for a partnership that could open doors throughout Asia. He had spent weeks preparing, reviewing cultural protocols, and studying the backgrounds of each delegate. Now suddenly he had 4 hours of unexpected free time stretching ahead of him. "Reschedule everything else," he heard himself saying. "I'm going home." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise his assistant. Edward Grant didn't go home in the middle of the day. He didn't have unexpected free time. His schedule was a precisely calibrated machine that had been running without interruption for years. But something about the empty space where the meeting should have been felt, like an invitation or perhaps a command, to break his own rules. The elevator ride from the 42nd floor to the parking garage passed in a blur. Edward found himself in the back of his car, watching Manhattan slide past the windows, without any clear memory of making the decision to leave. His driver, accustomed to sudden changes in routine, asked no questions and made no conversation during the 20-minute ride back to the residential tower that housed the penthouse. As the private elevator climbed toward the 57th floor, Edward felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, something that might have been anticipation, though he couldn't understand what he might be anticipating. Perhaps it was just the novelty of arriving home before sunset, of breaking the rigid routine that had governed his life since Lillian's death. Perhaps it was the hope, however irrational, that he might find Noah doing something different, something that would suggest progress was possible after all. The elevator doors opened with their usual whisper-quiet precision, revealing the familiar expanse of marble and chrome that served as the penthouse's entry hall. Edward stepped out, already mentally reviewing the list of tasks he could accomplish during his unexpected free time. Calls to return, reports to review, emails that had been accumulating while he sat through the morning's meetings. But then he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Music. It was faint, barely audible over the ambient hum of the penthouse's climate control system. Not the kind of music that played through the built-in sound system. Something with more texture, more imperfection. Something alive. Edward stood frozen in the entryway, his briefcase still in his hand, his mind struggling to process this impossible addition to the soundscape of his perfectly controlled environment. The melody was delicate but steady, a waltz that seemed to float rather than simply play. And underneath it, Even more impossible was the sound of movement. Not the mechanical whir of medical equipment or the efficient footsteps of staff members, but something fluid and organic. Something that sounded almost like dancing. Edward set his briefcase down slowly as if sudden movement might cause the sounds to disappear. He walked forward through the entryway, past the formal living room with its unused furniture and untouched coffee table books, following the music like a man in a trance. Each step brought the sounds into sharper focus, and with that clarity came a growing sense of disbelief that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think rationally. Someone was dancing in his home, in the space where silence had reigned supreme for 3 years, where every sound was muffled and every movement was careful and deliberate. Someone was dancing. As he reached the archway that led to the main living area, Edward paused, his hand gripping the marble column for support. What he saw in the room beyond challenged every assumption he had made about what was possible in his world. Rosa was moving across the marble floor with a grace that seemed to defy the reality of her position as a cleaning woman. Her feet were bare, her movements fluid and confident as she turned slowly in the sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her right hand was extended, fingers curved as if she were holding something precious and fragile. And she was holding something precious and fragile. Noah's hand was nestled in hers, his small fingers curled loosely around her palm as she guided his arm through a gentle arc. His wheelchair was positioned perfectly to allow his upper body to participate in the movement, and Rosa was spinning slowly around him, creating a dance that accommodated his limitations while never acknowledging them as limitations at all. But what stopped Edward's breath entirely, what made his vision blur and his knees threaten to buckle, was the expression on his son's face. Noah's head was tilted slightly upward, his pale blue eyes locked on Rosa's form, with an intensity that Edward hadn't seen in 3 years. He was tracking her movement, not with the vacant stare that had become his default expression, but with focused attention. His eyes were alive, present, engaged. He wasn't just watching her, he was participating, however subtly, in something that looked unmistakably like joy. Edward stood in the archway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any acknowledgement of what he was witnessing would cause it to vanish like a mirage. His mind raced through possible explanations. Hallucination, breakdown, some kind of elaborate therapy technique that he hadn't been informed about. But none of them could account for the simple, devastating reality of what he was seeing. His son, his broken, unreachable son, was dancing. The music began to slow, and Rosa turned gracefully to face the archway, as if she had known all along that Edward was standing there. Her expression wasn't startled or guilty or defensive. It was serene, almost peaceful, as if this moment of impossible magic was exactly what she had expected to find. When she looked up, she didn't release Noah's hand immediately. Instead, she stepped back slowly, allowing his arm to lower gently to his side, with the same fluid grace that had characterized their entire dance. Noah didn't flinch or retreat or shut down. His gaze shifted from Rosa to the floor, but not with the blank dissociation that Edward had grown accustomed to. It was natural, like a child who had been playing and was now ready to rest. Rosa offered a simple nod toward Edward, not apologetic, not guilty, just acknowledgement from one adult to another. There was no shame in her expression, no request for permission or forgiveness. She had done what she felt was right, and she was prepared to accept whatever consequences that choice might bring. Edward tried to speak, but his throat had closed entirely. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed. Rosa turned and began collecting her cleaning supplies, humming softly under her breath, as if the miracle that had just unfolded was as natural and unremarkable as any other part of her daily routine. It took several minutes before Edward could move. He stood like a man who had just survived an earthquake, his legs unsteady and his equilibrium completely destroyed. His mind reeled through a cascade of questions and emotions: disbelief, wonder, fear, hope, anger, gratitude, all competing for space in a consciousness that had been carefully structured to avoid exactly this kind of overwhelming experience. Was this a violation of the strict boundaries he had established around Noah's care? Was it a breakthrough that could change everything? Did Rosa have some kind of medical training that he wasn't aware of? Who had given her permission to touch his son, to move him, to engage with him in a way that no trained professional had been able to accomplish? And yet beneath all of those rational questions, one truth burned with undeniable clarity. What he had just witnessed was more real, more present, more alive than anything that had happened in their home since the accident. Rosa hadn't forced Noah to respond or manipulated him into participation. She had simply offered him an invitation to feel something other than numbness, and he had accepted. Edward walked slowly toward Noah's wheelchair, half expecting his son to revert to his usual catatonic state now that the spell had been broken. But Noah didn't shut down. He didn't retreat. His fingers curled slightly inward as if his hand retained the memory of Rosa's touch, and there was a subtle tension in his arm that suggested his muscles remembered what it felt like to move with purpose. And then, so faintly that Edward almost missed it, came the sound that shattered what remained of his composure. Noah was humming. The melody was barely audible, cracked and uncertain from years of disuse, but unmistakably the same waltz that Rosa had been playing. His lips were parted slightly, and the sound emerged as little more than breath shaped into music, but it was there. His son, his silent, unreachable son, was humming. Edward staggered backward, his hand pressed to his mouth to contain the sob that threatened to escape. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. He couldn't. The weight of what he had witnessed, the magnitude of the shift in their reality, was too enormous to process through words. He retreated to his office and spent the afternoon staring at security footage from the morning, rewinding and replaying the impossible scene until he had memorized every gesture, every movement, every second of the dance that had cracked open 3 years of silence. The image burned itself into his consciousness, Rosa spinning slowly in the sunlight, Noah's eyes tracking her movement with focused attention, the two of them connected by something that transcended medical explanation or rational understanding. That night, Edward didn't pour himself his usual scotch. He didn't respond to the emails that had accumulated during his absence. He sat alone in the dark living room, listening not to music but to the absence of it, trying to understand how a cleaning woman with no medical training had accomplished in a single dance what an army of specialists had failed to achieve in 3 years. Rosa, he realized, had done something that all of his money and expertise and determination had been unable to do. She had treated Noah not as a broken thing that needed to be fixed, but as a complete person who deserved to feel joy. She had offered him not therapy or treatment or rehabilitation, but simply the opportunity to be present in a moment of beauty. And Noah had chosen to accept that offer. As Edward finally made his way to bed in the early hours of the morning, he found himself humming, actually humming, the same melody that had filled his home that afternoon. The sound felt foreign in his throat, rusty from years of disuse, but undeniably real. For the first time since Lillian's death, Edward Grant fell asleep to the sound of music instead of silence, and in his dreams he danced. The next morning arrived with the weight of unfinished business, hanging over the penthouse like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Edward had spent a sleepless night replaying the impossible scene he had witnessed, his mind cycling between wonder and concern, hope and the terrifying possibility that he had imagined the entire thing. But when he checked the security footage again at dawn, there it was, indisputable evidence that his carefully controlled world had been turned upside down by a woman with bare feet and a melody. He waited until the staff had dispersed to their various duties before summoning Rosa to his office. The room was a testament to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a desk carved from a single piece of walnut, walls lined with awards and photographs documenting his rise from struggling entrepreneur to billionaire CEO. It was a space designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of the vast gulf between his power and their dependence on his goodwill. Rosa entered without hesitation, her chin slightly raised in a way that suggested she was prepared for whatever conversation was about to unfold. She declined his gesture toward the leather chair positioned across from his desk, choosing instead to stand with her hands folded in front of her cleaning apron. Her posture was respectful but not submissive, dignified but not defiant. She was, Edward realized, completely unintimidated by the trappings of his wealth and authority. "Explain what you were doing," he said, his voice deliberately low and clipped. He had practiced this conversation during his sleepless night, preparing himself to be firm but fair, authoritative but not cruel. He needed answers, and he needed them to make sense within the framework of rules and protocols that governed every aspect of Noah's care. Rosa met his eyes directly, her expression calm and unwavering. "I was dancing," she said simply. The straightforward honesty of her response caught Edward off guard. He had expected defensiveness, excuses, perhaps an attempt to explain away what had happened as some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, she had given him exactly what he had asked for, an explanation that was both completely accurate and utterly insufficient. "With my son," he said, his jaw tightening as he spoke the words. Rosa nodded once. "Yes?" The silence that followed was sharp with tension. Edward rose from his chair and began pacing behind his desk, his movements sharp and agitated. Everything about this conversation was wrong. Rosa should have been apologetic, flustered, eager to explain herself and beg for forgiveness. Instead, she stood like a woman who had done exactly what she intended to do and was prepared to accept the consequences without regret. Why? The question came out harder than he had intended, nearly spat rather than spoken. Rosa's expression didn't change. "Because I saw something in him," she said, her voice steady and sure. "A flicker. I played a song, and his fingers twitched. He followed the rhythm. So I moved with him." Edward stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "You are not a therapist, Rosa," "You are not trained. You don't touch my son." The words came out harsher than he had planned, fueled by 3 years of carefully maintained control and the terrifying realization that all of his systems and protocols had been rendered meaningless by a woman who cleaned floors for a living. He expected her to flinch, to step back, to show some sign that his authority still meant something in this conversation. Instead, Rosa's reply was immediate, firm, but never disrespectful. "No one else touches him either," she said quietly. "Not with joy, not with trust. I didn't force him. I followed him." The truth of that statement hit Edward like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had touched Noah with joy? When was the last time someone had approached him as a source of pleasure rather than a problem to be solved? The therapist touched him with clinical precision. The nurses touched him with medical necessity. His own father touched him with the careful desperation of someone afraid of causing further damage. But joy? Trust? When had those things disappeared from Noah's experience entirely? Edward resumed his pacing, his movements more agitated now as Rosa's calmness continued to unnerve him. "You could have undone months of therapy," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Years, there is structure, protocol." Rosa said nothing, allowing his statement to hang in the air between them. Her silence was more powerful than any argument she could have made, because they both knew the truth. The months and years of therapy had produced no measurable progress. The structure and protocol he was so desperately defending had failed completely to reach the child they were supposed to help. Edward turned toward her, his voice rising with frustration, and something that might have been fear. "Do you know what I pay for his care? What his specialists say?" Rosa finally spoke again, her words coming slower this time, weighted with a kind of gentle certainty that made them impossible to dismiss. "Yes," she said, "and yet they don't see what I saw today. He chose to follow with his eyes, with his spirit, not because he was told to, because he wanted to." Edward felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. This wasn't how the conversation was supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control, setting boundaries, reestablishing the order that governed their lives. Instead, he found himself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that Rosa had accomplished something that all of his money and expertise had failed to achieve. "You think a smile is enough?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "That music and twirling solve trauma?" Rosa didn't answer immediately. She knew it wasn't her place to argue theoretical points about trauma recovery or child psychology. She wasn't qualified to debate treatment methodologies with a man who had consulted with the best specialists in the world. But she also knew that trying to engage on that level would miss the essential truth of what had happened. Instead, she said something that cut straight to the heart of everything Edward was afraid to acknowledge. "I danced because I wanted to make him smile because no one else has." The words landed harder than she had perhaps intended. Edward's fists clenched at his sides, his throat suddenly dry as the full impact of her statement sank in. How long had it been since anyone had approached Noah with the simple, uncomplicated desire to bring him joy? How long since someone had looked at him and seen not a collection of symptoms and deficits, but a child who deserved to feel happiness? "You crossed a line," Edward said. But his voice had lost its authority. The anger was still there, but it was mixed now with something more complex and harder to define. Rosa nodded once, acknowledging the truth of his statement without showing any sign of regret. "Maybe," she said, "but I'd do it again." The simple declaration hung between them like a challenge. Edward had come close to firing her. The impulse was there, demanding that he reestablish control and order, that he protect the systems he had built to shield the people he loved from further harm. But something in Rosa's last sentence clung to him, refusing to be dismissed. "He was alive, Mr. Grant," she said quietly, "even just for a minute." Edward felt the fight go out of him all at once. He sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted by the effort of maintaining his anger in the face of her unshakable certainty. She was right, and they both knew it. For one brief, impossible moment, Noah had been present in a way he hadn't been since the accident. The clinical measurements and therapeutic goals that had governed their lives for 3 years had been rendered meaningless by a few minutes of spontaneous movement and music. He dismissed Rosa with a small wave of his hand, unable to trust his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. She gave one final nod and left him alone in his office, surrounded by all the symbols of his success and power, feeling more disarmed and uncertain than he had in years. Edward stared out the window at the city stretching below, his reflection ghosted in the glass like a man haunting his own life. He had expected to feel victorious after putting Rosa in her place, to have restored the sense of control that her actions had threatened. Instead, he felt hollow, as if something essential had been taken from him during their conversation. Her words echoed in his mind, not with rebellion or sentiment, but with the terrible clarity of truth. She hadn't begged to stay or pleaded her case, or tried to convince him that what she had done was justified by any standard he might recognize. She had simply told him what she had seen in Noah, something he hadn't seen in years. It was like she had spoken directly to a wound in him that still bled beneath all the layers of efficiency and logic he had built up around his grief. The realization that followed was even more disturbing. Rosa hadn't just reached Noah with her dancing. She had reached him too, in ways that he wasn't ready to acknowledge or understand. That night, Edward sat on the edge of his bed with a glass of scotch that remained untouched, staring at the floor while his mind wrestled with the implications of what had happened. The music Rosa had played, he hadn't even recognized the song, but the rhythm stayed with him like a persistent memory. It was soft and familiar, like breathing choreographed into melody. As he sat in the quiet of his room, Edward tried to remember the last time he had heard music in their home that wasn't connected to a therapist's recommendation or some clinical attempt at stimulation. The effort brought back memories he had been avoiding for 3 years. Memories of Lillian dancing barefoot in their kitchen, humming melodies that seemed to come from some deep well of happiness he had never learned to access. She had loved to dance, not professionally, but with the kind of freedom that came from never doubting that joy was something worth pursuing. Edward remembered finding her in the living room one evening, just after Noah had taken his first steps, swaying to music only she could hear, while their toddler son clung to her legs and giggled with delight. Edward had felt ridiculous when she pulled him into the dance, his movements awkward and self-conscious compared to her natural grace, but for those few minutes, he had allowed himself to be carried by her rhythm, to feel light and unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with business strategies or financial projections. That was before the accident, before the wheelchairs and the silence and the careful distance he had learned to maintain from anything that might threaten his emotional equilibrium. He hadn't danced since Lillian's death. He hadn't let himself remember what it felt like to move without purpose, other than the simple pleasure of movement itself. But tonight, alone in the dark, he found himself swaying slightly in his chair, not quite dancing, not quite still, unable to resist the pull of a memory that Rosa's music had awakened. The movement felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like speaking a language he had once known fluently but hadn't used in years. Eventually, Edward rose and walked quietly to Noah's room. He opened the door softly, expecting to find his son in his usual position by the window, lost in the blank contemplation that had become his default state. Instead, he discovered something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Noah was humming. The sound was so faint that Edward might have missed it if he hadn't been listening for signs of life, but it was unmistakably there. His son's lips were parted slightly, and a breathy melody emerged, off-pitch and trembling, but recognizably the same waltz that Rosa had played that afternoon. Noah was rocking almost imperceptibly as he hummed, a motion so subtle that it might have been mistaken for the natural sway of breathing. Edward stood in the doorway, afraid to move closer, afraid that his presence might break whatever fragile spell was allowing this moment to exist. For the first time in 3 years, Noah was making music. It wasn't speech, wasn't a breakthrough in any clinical sense, but it was evidence of an inner life that Edward had begun to fear was lost forever. His son was still in there, somewhere beneath the layers of trauma and silence, and Rosa had found a way to call him back, however briefly, to the surface. Edward returned to his own room with tears in his eyes and a weight in his chest that felt like the first tremor of an earthquake. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark and listened to the absence of music, replaying in his mind the impossible sight of his son in motion, the sound of melody returning to a voice that had been silent for so long. Something fundamental had shifted in their world, and Edward wasn't sure whether he should be grateful or terrified by the change. All he knew was that Rosa had opened a door he had thought was permanently sealed, and now he had to decide whether he was brave enough to walk through it. Rosa returned to work the following morning, with the same quiet dignity she had always displayed, but Edward found himself watching her with new eyes. He observed her movements through the penthouse, noting the way she hummed softly while organizing supplies, the gentle rhythm that seemed to govern her every gesture, the complete absence of the nervous energy that most staff members displayed in his presence. She didn't seek him out for clarification about her position or attempt to gauge his mood after their confrontation. Instead, she simply went about her work with the same careful attention to detail she had always shown, cleaning surfaces that were already spotless and organizing spaces that had never been disturbed. But there was something different in the air now, a subtle shift in the energy of the home that Edward couldn't quite define. The change became more apparent when Rosa entered Noah's room to continue her regular cleaning routine. Edward positioned himself in the hallway, partially concealed behind the doorframe, telling himself he was merely observing to ensure that appropriate boundaries were maintained. But the truth was more complex. He was drawn to watch this woman who had accomplished the impossible, hoping to understand the secret of her success. Rosa didn't speak to Noah directly. She didn't acknowledge him with the artificially cheerful greetings that therapists used or attempt to engage him in conversation. Instead, she moved through her tasks with the same fluid grace she had displayed during their dance, humming melodies that seemed to fill the space between them without demanding any response. At first, Noah remained as motionless as ever, his wheelchair positioned by the window, and his face betraying none of the animation Edward was desperate to see. But Rosa didn't appear to expect miracles. She swept and dusted with deliberate rhythm, occasionally changing her tune to let the melody dip into minor keys or flutter through more complex progressions. Edward couldn't identify the songs she hummed. They weren't nursery rhymes or classical pieces or anything from popular culture. They sounded older, more fundamental, like lullabies that had been passed down through generations by memory rather than sheet music. There was something almost ancient about the melodies, as if they carried emotional truths that transcended language or cultural boundaries. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Noah began to respond. On the third day of Edward's surveillance, he noticed that Noah's eyes followed Rosa's movement for just a second when she passed near his chair. It was barely noticeable, a slight shift in focus that lasted no more than a heartbeat, but Edward saw it. Rosa didn't react or make any acknowledgement of the response. She simply continued her work, allowing the moment to exist without drawing attention to it. The next day, it happened again. This time, Noah's gaze lingered for 2 seconds, tracking Rosa's path across the room before drifting back to the window. Again, she showed no sign of having noticed, but Edward caught the almost imperceptible pause in her humming, a brief musical rest that somehow acknowledged the connection without demanding more. By the end of the week, Noah was blinking twice when Rosa changed direction. Not random blinks, but purposeful ones that seemed to constitute a form of communication. Edward recognized the pattern from their old bedtime rituals, when Noah would blink twice to mean yes, and once to mean no in the silly games they used to play before sleep. It was almost like watching a conversation conducted entirely in silence, with Rosa offering gentle invitations through her presence and movement, while Noah responded in the only way he could manage. Edward found himself holding his breath during these exchanges, afraid that any disturbance might break the delicate thread of connection that was slowly being woven between them. Rosa never imposed expectations or timelines on these interactions. She didn't push for more engagement or celebrate the small victories in ways that might make Noah self-conscious about his responses. Instead, she created a consistent presence that he could lean into when he felt ready, offering rhythm and melody as gifts rather than requirements. Sometimes she would pause in her cleaning to tap a wooden spoon gently against a bucket, creating soft percussion that barely qualified as sound, but somehow filled the room with intentional music. During these moments, Edward would watch Noah's foot twitch, just once, barely perceptible, but unmistakably in time with Rosa's quiet beat. Other times, Rosa would leave a brightly colored cleaning cloth on the table near Noah's chair, not as bait or encouragement, but simply as an offering of beauty in a space that had been drained of color for too long. Noah would glance toward it, his eyes lingering for a moment on the splash of yellow or red or blue that Rosa had introduced into his carefully controlled environment. These weren't breakthroughs in any traditional sense. No therapist would have documented them as measurable progress, and Edward couldn't explain to anyone else why these tiny gestures felt so monumentally important. But he was learning to recognize the difference between the mechanical responses that medical professionals tried to elicit and the organic connections that Rosa seemed to nurture without effort. The most significant change, however, was happening not just in Noah but in Edward himself. He found himself staying longer behind the hallway wall each morning, his breathing slowing to match Rosa's unhurried pace. The frantic energy that usually drove him through his days was being replaced by something quieter. Not relaxation exactly, but a kind of focused attention that he hadn't experienced since before Lillian's death. He tried once to explain what he was observing to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Noah's physical therapist, but the words died in his mouth before he could form them into coherent sentences. How could he articulate the significance of eye twitches and finger curls to someone who measured progress in terms of range of motion and response time? How could he describe the way Rosa's presence seemed to create a pocket of possibility in a space that had been dominated by medical necessity? Dr. Hendricks would have called it anecdotal evidence, interesting but unverifiable, difficult to replicate in controlled conditions. She would have asked for measurable data, for quantifiable improvements that could be documented and tracked over time. But Edward was beginning to understand that what was happening between Rosa and Noah existed in a realm that couldn't be captured by charts and graphs. It was about trust. It was about the radical act of seeing Noah not as a collection of symptoms to be managed, but as a complete person who deserved to experience joy, even if that joy had to be measured in blinks and twitches rather than words and movement. Rosa treated these moments like seeds rather than performances, something to be tended with patience rather than celebrated with fanfare. She never announced what was happening or called attention to Noah's responses. When her shift ended each day, she would gather her supplies, nod politely to Edward if their paths crossed, and disappear down the elevator as if she hadn't just participated in the gradual resurrection of a child who had been lost to the world. On the sixth day of Edward's observation, something happened that shifted the entire dynamic of what he thought he understood about his son's condition. Rosa was finishing her usual routine when she walked to the table near Noah's wheelchair and paused. Without saying a word, she pulled a napkin from her pocket, plain white, the kind they kept in bulk for practical use, and placed it carefully on the surface where Edward would be sure to see it. She glanced once toward the hallway where she knew he was watching, a look that was neither challenging nor submissive, but simply acknowledging. Then she left, taking her supplies and her quiet music with her, leaving behind only the napkin and the echo of melody that seemed to linger in the air even after she was gone. Edward waited until he was certain Rosa had left the floor before approaching the table. The napkin appeared unremarkable at first glance, but when he picked it up, he discovered something that made his hands tremble and his vision blur with tears he couldn't control. Someone had drawn on the napkin in pencil, childlike lines that were hesitant and uneven, with smudges where the artist had erased and redrawn details multiple times. But the image was unmistakable. Two stick figures with their arms extended, caught mid-spin in what could only be interpreted as a dance. One figure had hair drawn in bold, flowing lines, while the other had a simple circle for a head and appeared to be seated. Edward sank into the chair beside the table, clutching the napkin as if it were the most precious artifact in the world. He didn't need to ask who had created this drawing. The lines were uncertain and shaky in the way that suggested fingers that hadn't held a pencil in years, hands that had forgotten the muscle memory of artistic expression, but were slowly remembering. Noah had drawn this. His son, who hadn't initiated any form of communication in 3 years, who hadn't shown interest in art or creativity or self-expression since the accident, had somehow found the motivation and coordination to capture the moment of his dance with Rosa. More than that, he had chosen to share it, to leave it where his father would find it, like a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of silence. The simplicity of the drawing was more devastating than any photograph could have been. In those few uncertain lines, Edward could see everything. The moment Rosa had spun with Noah's hand in hers, the way the sunlight had caught them both in its warmth, the expression of pure presence that had transformed his son's face from blank to alive. But most importantly, he could see that this was what Noah had chosen to remember. Out of all the moments in his days, the medical procedures, the therapy sessions, the careful ministrations of nurses and doctors, this was the experience that had been significant enough to preserve in art. This dance, this connection, this brief taste of joy had been worth the enormous effort required to translate it from memory to image. Edward didn't frame the drawing or show it to anyone or call attention to its existence in any way. Instead, he placed it carefully back on the table exactly where Rosa had left it, understanding instinctively that this gift wasn't meant to be celebrated or analyzed or preserved in any formal way. It was simply meant to be witnessed, acknowledgement that something beautiful had happened and that beauty deserved to be remembered. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the penthouse floor and the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, the napkin remained exactly where Rosa had placed it. It served as proof that somewhere inside Noah's silence, creativity, and emotion, and the desire to communicate were still alive, waiting for the right invitation to emerge. Edward sat beside the drawing as the sun set, understanding for the first time that healing wasn't something that could be imposed or purchased or strategically implemented. It was something that grew in the spaces between people, nurtured by patience and trust, and the radical belief that connection was always possible, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Rosa had given them more than a moment of dancing. She had given them hope that was grounded not in medical possibilities, but in human truth, that every person, no matter how broken they might appear, carried within them an essential spark that could be reached by someone willing to approach them with genuine love. The therapy session that would change everything began exactly as every other session had for the past 18 months. Dr. Sarah Chen, Noah's speech therapist, arrived at the penthouse at precisely 10 Hawaii a.m., her materials organized in a leather portfolio that contained visual aids, communication boards, and assessment forms that had remained largely blank since their work together began. Dr. Chen was competent, kind, and professionally optimistic in the way that comes from years of training and experience. She spoke to Noah in gentle, encouraging tones, offered choices between simple options, and waited patiently for responses that rarely came. Her methods were evidence-based and had proven successful with dozens of other children. The fact that they weren't working with Noah wasn't anyone's fault. It was simply another data point in the complex puzzle of trauma recovery. Edward stood on the other side of the glass partition that separated Noah's therapy room from the hallway, arms crossed in his habitual posture of controlled observation. He had attended hundreds of these sessions over the years, each one following the same predictable pattern: gentle engagement, careful prompting, patient waiting, and ultimately disappointed documentation of minimal progress. Carla, the head nurse who had been with their family since the accident, sat in her usual corner chair, taking notes and occasionally offering supportive comments when Dr. Chen looked in her direction. The dynamic was familiar, professional, and utterly ineffective, but it represented the best that money could buy and medical science could offer. Then the elevator chimed, and Rosa stepped into the therapy room. She moved with her characteristic quiet confidence, carrying a folded scarf in her hands, soft fabric in muted blues and greens that looked worn in the way that suggested sentimental value rather than neglect. She didn't interrupt or announce her presence. She simply stood at the threshold of the room, waiting until Dr. Chen noticed her arrival. There was a moment of hesitation as the therapist tried to process this deviation from their established routine. The cleaning staff didn't usually enter during therapy sessions, and Rosa's presence introduced an element of unpredictability into a carefully controlled environment. But before Dr. Chen could object or ask for clarification, Rosa stepped forward with purposeful intent. Edward leaned closer to the glass, his heart beginning to race as he recognized the signs of another impossible moment about to unfold. Rosa approached Noah's wheelchair without the careful distance that medical professionals maintained. She didn't kneel to his eye level or speak in the artificially animated voice that therapists used. Instead, she simply held up the scarf, letting it dangle and sway like a gentle pendulum, and asked a question that was both simple and revolutionary. "Want to try again?" The words were spoken softly, without pressure or expectation. It wasn't a therapeutic prompt designed to elicit a specific response. It was an invitation, open-ended and genuine, from one person to another. Rosa tilted her head slightly as she spoke, her expression conveying nothing more than mild curiosity about Noah's preferences. The room held its collective breath. Dr. Chen turned slightly, unsure whether to intervene or observe. Carla's pen froze above her notepad as she watched this unprecedented deviation from protocol. Edward's hand pressed against the glass, his vision tunneling until the only thing he could see was his son's face. Noah blinked once, then again. Two slow, deliberate blinks that Edward recognized as the signal they had used in bedtime games years ago. The unmistakable sign for yes. Dr. Chen gasped quietly, the sound escaping before she could contain it. Edward's hand slipped from the glass as his knees threatened to buckle. The magnitude of what had just happened was almost impossible to process. Noah had understood a question, made a conscious choice, and communicated his decision clearly. He had said yes. Rosa didn't cheer or react with visible excitement. She simply smiled, not at Noah but with him, and began to slowly loop the scarf around her fingers. What followed was a demonstration of intuitive therapy that no textbook had ever described, and no certification program had ever taught. Rosa made a gentle game of wrapping the scarf around her hand and then unraveling it, letting the fabric flutter and dance in the air. Each time she allowed the scarf to graze past Noah's fingertips, she paused to see if he would reach for it. There was no pressure, no coaxing, no verbal encouragement, just patient offering of opportunity. After several passes, Noah's hand twitched, not a reflexive movement or an involuntary response, but a deliberate attempt to make contact with the soft fabric. He didn't grab the scarf or make any dramatic gesture, but his fingers moved with unmistakable intention. Rosa acknowledged the movement by letting the scarf rest against his palm for a moment, before gently pulling it away and beginning the pattern again. She was following a language that only she and Noah seemed to understand, responding to cues so subtle that they were invisible to everyone else in the room. Dr. Chen stood speechless, her carefully planned session forgotten, as she watched this untrained cleaning woman accomplish what months of professional intervention had failed to achieve. The interaction was completely outside the bounds of established therapeutic protocols, yet it was undeniably effective in ways that defied clinical explanation. Edward remained behind the glass, his body rigid with the effort of containing emotions that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think rationally. For 3 years, he had paid the most qualified professionals in the world to unlock his son's potential. He had invested millions in state-of-the-art equipment and cutting-edge techniques. And here was Rosa, with no credentials and no training, holding a simple piece of fabric and coaxing responses from Noah that no one else had been able to elicit. It wasn't just the physical interaction that was remarkable, it was the quality of attention that Rosa brought to the moment. She wasn't following a treatment plan or working toward predetermined goals. She was simply being present with Noah, allowing him to set the pace and define the terms of their interaction. The session continued for another 20 minutes, with Rosa patiently offering the scarf and Noah gradually becoming more responsive to her movements. By the end, he was making deliberate contact with the fabric each time it passed within reach, and his eyes remained focused on Rosa's face rather than drifting to the window or the floor. When Rosa finally gathered the scarf and prepared to leave, she did so without fanfare or celebration. She nodded politely to Dr. Chen, acknowledged Carla with a brief smile, and walked toward the door as if what had just transpired was no more remarkable than any other part of her daily routine. Edward found himself following her out of the therapy room, his legs moving without conscious direction. He caught up with her near the elevator bank, where she was waiting for the car that would take her back to the service floor where cleaning supplies were stored. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion he couldn't control. Rosa turned to face him, her expression calm but not unsympathetic. Know what? How to reach him. What to do. She considered the question for a moment, as if trying to translate an instinctive understanding into words that would make sense to someone else. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I just watched. I listened. He told me what he needed." The simplicity of her answer was both enlightening and frustrating. Edward had spent years analyzing Noah's condition, consulting with experts, studying research papers and treatment protocols. He had approached his son's recovery with the same systematic methodology that had built his business empire. But Rosa had accomplished more in 20 minutes than all of that effort had achieved, simply by paying attention to what Noah was actually communicating rather than what the professionals expected him to communicate. "You're not trained for this," Edward said, though the words carried less authority than accusation now. "No," Rosa agreed, "but maybe that's why it works." The elevator arrived and Rosa stepped inside without looking back. Edward stood in the hallway long after the doors had closed, trying to process the implications of what he had witnessed. His son had responded to a question. He had made choices and communicated those choices clearly. He had engaged with another person in a way that suggested not just awareness, but genuine desire for connection. And it had happened not because of expert intervention or expensive equipment, but because a cleaning woman had approached Noah with curiosity instead of pity, with respect instead of condescension, with the radical belief that he was capable of more than anyone else imagined. That afternoon, Edward found himself unable to concentrate on the stack of reports that demanded his attention. Instead, he kept returning to the image of Noah reaching for Rosa's scarf, the deliberate intention in that simple gesture, the presence behind his eyes that had been absent for so long. For the first time since the accident, Edward allowed himself to consider the possibility that recovery might not look like what he had expected. Perhaps healing wouldn't come through medical breakthroughs or therapeutic techniques. Perhaps it would come through the kind of patient, respectful attention that Rosa offered. Attention that saw Noah not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be known. Back in her small apartment that evening, Rosa sat at her kitchen table with the scarf spread across the surface, running her fingers over the soft fabric that had belonged to her mother. She hadn't planned to bring it to work or to use it in whatever was developing between her and Noah, but something about the boy's stillness, his careful watching, had reminded her of herself at his age, trapped in circumstances beyond her control, desperate for someone to see past the surface of her situation to the person waiting underneath. The scarf smelled faintly of lavender and thyme, scents that her mother had loved and that Rosa had carried with her through years of uncertainty and loss. It wasn't therapeutic equipment or a carefully designed intervention tool. It was simply a connection to love and memory offered freely to a child who had been surrounded by expertise but starved of genuine human warmth. Rosa understood something that all the professionals had missed. Noah didn't need to be fixed because he wasn't broken. He was protecting himself in the only way he knew how, and any real healing would have to begin with respect for the intelligence of that protection. She folded the scarf carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed, already knowing that she would bring it again tomorrow. Not because she had a plan or because she understood the science of what was happening, but because Noah had asked her to try again. And that was the only invitation she needed. The discovery happened purely by accident, if accident was even the right word for something that felt so inevitable in retrospect. Rosa had been cleaning the storage room with more thoroughness than the task strictly required, drawn by the same instinct that had led her to dance with Noah weeks earlier. Something about the penthouse was calling for a deeper attention, for the kind of careful tending that went beyond surface maintenance. The storage room hadn't been properly organized in years. Edward insisted that certain items be preserved just in case, but he never visited the space himself, leaving it to accumulate the detritus of a life that had been frozen in time since Lillian's death. Boxes marked Lillian Keep sat stacked against one wall, their contents untouched and gathering dust like artifacts in a museum that no one visited. Rosa moved the boxes carefully, not out of curiosity, but from a professional instinct to clean the surfaces beneath them. As she shifted a stack of containers marked with dates from 5 years past, an antique cabinet in the corner creaked slightly, and a small drawer that had been concealed behind the boxes slid partially open. Inside the drawer was nothing but dust and silence and a single envelope, yellowed at the corners with age and sealed with old-fashioned care. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably feminine, written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. The words made Rosa's breath catch in her throat. To Edward Grant, only if he forgets how to feel. Rosa stared at the envelope for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. This wasn't something she should open, wasn't something meant for her eyes. But the specificity of the inscription suggested that Lillian had anticipated a moment exactly like this one, a time when Edward would need to be reminded of something he had lost or buried beneath the weight of grief and responsibility. She didn't open the letter. She knew that whatever it contained was meant for Edward alone, and her role was simply to ensure that it found its way to him. But holding the envelope, feeling the weight of words that had been waiting years to be discovered, Rosa understood that she was participating in something larger than coincidence. She waited until the house had settled into its evening quiet before approaching Edward's office. He was sitting behind his massive desk, the lights dimmed and his attention focused on documents that clearly weren't holding his interest. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway with the envelope in her hands, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching alarm. "I found something," Rosa said simply, offering no explanation beyond the obvious truth. Edward's eyes fixed on the envelope, and even from across the room, he could see the handwriting that had once filled birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes tucked into his briefcase. His face went pale as Rosa approached, and placed the envelope on his desk with reverent care. "Where?" he asked, his voice hollow. "In storage, behind a drawer labeled Personal." It was sealed. Edward took the envelope with hands that shook despite his efforts to control them. For a long moment, he didn't move, just stared at the inscription, as if trying to decode a message written in a language he had forgotten how to read. When he finally opened it, Rosa started to leave, understanding that whatever was inside wasn't meant to be shared. "Stay," Edward said, the word coming out more like a plea than a command. Rosa paused in the doorway, then stepped back inside and closed the door behind her. She remained standing while Edward unfolded the letter with the careful precision of someone handling something infinitely precious and potentially devastating. His eyes scanned the page once, then again, then a third time as his expression unraveled with each reading. The controlled composure that he wore like armor began to crack, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. "She wrote this 3 days before the crash," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosa said nothing, understanding that her role in this moment was simply to witness whatever needed to be witnessed, to offer the kind of silent support that didn't require words or explanations. Edward's voice faltered as he began to read aloud, the words catching in his throat but carrying the weight of prophecy and love. "If you're reading this, it means you've forgotten how to feel, or maybe you've buried it too deep. Edward, don't try to fix him. He doesn't need solutions. He needs someone who believes he's still in there. Even if he never walks again, even if he never says another word, just believe in who he was, who he still is." The words hit Edward like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the protective distance he had built around his emotions. His hands trembled as he continued reading, his voice becoming smaller and more broken with each phrase. "His hands need to find the rhythm. Maybe someone will reach him when I'm gone. I hope they do. I hope you let them." Edward didn't try to finish the rest. He folded the paper and bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come from grief too long held in check. It wasn't a quiet cry or a dignified display of emotion. It was raw and unguarded, the sound of a man finally allowing himself to break under the weight of 3 years of carefully controlled pain. Rosa didn't offer comfort through words or platitudes. She simply stepped closer and rested a hand on his shoulder, not as a servant offering consolation to her employer, but as one human being acknowledging another's suffering. Her touch was steady and warm, carrying no agenda other than the simple recognition that no one should have to carry such pain alone. Edward leaned forward, covering his face with both hands as the sobs continued to come in waves. Each one seemed to take something from him, pride, perhaps, or the illusion of control, but what remained looked more human than he had allowed himself to be in years. The grief wasn't just for Lillian, though. Her absence filled every corner of the room like a presence that refused to be ignored. It was for the years he had spent trying to solve Noah's silence instead of simply sitting with him in it. It was for all the ways he had chosen expertise over intuition, protocol over presence, the safety of clinical distance over the terrifying vulnerability of real connection. Rosa didn't move until his breathing began to calm, until the storm of emotion had passed through him and left something quieter in its wake. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were red and wet, but there was something different in his expression, something that looked like relief. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. The words weren't meant as flattery or casual comfort. They carried the weight of recognition, of understanding that had been years in the making. Lillian would have seen in Rosa the same qualities that had drawn her to dance with Noah: the courage to approach another person with genuine care, the wisdom to offer presence instead of solutions, the faith that connection was always possible if you were brave enough to remain open to it. Rosa's response came quietly, without hesitation. "I think she already does." The sentence hung in the air between them, neither mystical nor sentimental, but carrying a truth that transcended rational explanation. In that moment, with Lillian's letter open on the desk, and the weight of her words still echoing in the room, it felt entirely possible that love could reach across the boundaries of life and death, that guidance could come from those who were gone to those who were still struggling to find their way. Edward picked up the letter again and read the final line, this time in a whisper that was more prayer than speech. "Teach him to dance even when I'm gone." Rosa exhaled slowly, her heart tightening as she recognized the words that had been haunting her dreams for weeks. She had felt drawn to Noah's stillness, compelled to offer him movement and music without understanding why. Now she knew. She had been answering a request that had been made before she ever set foot in their home, fulfilling a wish that had been waiting years for the right person to receive it. "I think she already does," Rosa repeated, and this time Edward understood what she meant. Lillian's presence wasn't gone. It had simply taken a different form, working through Rosa's hands and voice and intuitive understanding to reach the son she could no longer hold. Edward folded the letter one final time and placed it in the center of his desk, where it would remain visible, not hidden or stored, but present and acknowledged. For the first time since Lillian's death, he allowed himself to feel her guidance not as a memory to be treasured, but as a living force that could still shape their future. That night, alone in her small apartment, Rosa sat by her window and looked out at the city lights, understanding that she had been part of something larger than employment from the very beginning. She had been called to this family not by coincidence, but by the kind of love that refuses to be contained by death, that finds ways to keep working in the world through willing hearts and open hands. The next morning, she returned to the penthouse early, humming again as she gathered her supplies. But this time, her humming carried a different quality. Not just melody, but prayer. Not just sound, but the echo of a promise being kept by someone who had loved deeply enough to ensure that her love would continue even in her absence. The ribbon had become their shared language, a yellow thread of connection that transformed the sterile therapy room into a space where miracles could unfold quietly, without fanfare or medical documentation. Rosa brought it each morning now, not as equipment or a therapeutic tool, but as an invitation to whatever lay waiting beneath Noah's careful stillness. She had never announced its purpose or explained her methodology to anyone. The ribbon simply appeared in her gentle hands, and Noah's eyes would brighten almost imperceptibly, the only sign he needed to give that he was ready to participate in whatever quiet dance they would create together. "This is just for us," Rosa had told him on the first day she brought the faded yellow fabric, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made promises feel safe. "No pressure, we'll let the ribbon do the work." She looped it loosely around his hand and her own, creating a physical connection that somehow translated into emotional understanding. Then she moved slowly, teaching him to follow motion with motion, not with his legs, never demanding what his body couldn't provide, but with his arms and torso and the subtle sway of his upper body that remembered what it felt like to be part of something rhythmic and alive. At first, it was almost nothing. A faint shift of his wrist when she moved left, a barely perceptible tilt of his elbow when she stepped back. But Rosa celebrated every millimeter of effort as if it were a standing ovation, whispering encouragement that felt more like recognition than praise. "There," she would say softly when Noah managed to extend his arm in harmony with her movement. "That's it. That's dancing." Noah would respond with the same slow double blink that had become his way of saying yes, and the conversation would continue in this language of touch and rhythm that needed no words to communicate profound truths about connection and joy. Edward watched from the doorway more frequently now, no longer hiding his observation, but not yet ready to participate. His presence had shifted from surveillance to something closer to reverence, as if he were witnessing a religious ceremony whose significance he was only beginning to understand. The sessions grew more complex, gradually, organically, without pressure or artificial timelines. Rosa added a second ribbon, allowing Noah to practice extending both arms in gentle arcs while she stood behind him, guiding but never forcing. His movements became more fluid, more confident, as if his body was remembering a language it had spoken fluently before trauma taught it to be silent. And Noah was responding in ways that transcended the physical. He no longer looked away when Rosa spoke to him. His eyes stayed focused on hers, not always, but more often. And there was something behind them now that looked unmistakably like anticipation. He was beginning to expect their sessions, to prepare for them in ways that suggested he was thinking about dancing even when the ribbons weren't present. "You're not following," Rosa told him one afternoon, smiling as she watched him lift his arm slightly before she had even begun to move. "You're leading." Noah didn't smile in return, not yet, not quite, but the corners of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of one. The response was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Rosa saw it and understood its significance. Somewhere inside his careful stillness, joy was stirring to life again. Edward began to notice changes in himself as well. He no longer stood with his arms crossed during these sessions. His shoulders weren't as rigid, and he found himself unconsciously swaying slightly to rhythms that Rosa created with her movements. The careful distance he had maintained from anything that might threaten his emotional equilibrium was dissolving, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. He had built his entire life around strategy and control, around the belief that every problem could be solved through sufficient analysis and resources. But what Rosa was creating with Noah couldn't be replicated in a laboratory or measured in clinical assessments. It existed in the space between two people who had chosen to trust each other, and it grew stronger each day not because of any technique but because of the simple, radical decision to approach another human being with genuine care. Rosa never asked Edward to join their sessions. She understood that invitation had to come from readiness, not expectation, and that forcing participation would destroy the delicate ecosystem of trust they had spent weeks building. But she left space for him in their rhythm, a gap in their circle that remained open in case he ever chose to step into it. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The moment when possibility transformed into reality in ways that no one could have anticipated. Rosa and Noah were practicing their usual sequence, the yellow ribbon connecting their hands as they moved together in a gentle pattern that had become as familiar as breathing. The music played softly from Rosa's small speaker, the same wordless melody they always used, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Noah's gradual awakening. But something was different this time. As Rosa stepped slightly to the side, Noah followed not just with his arms but with his entire torso, leaning into the movement with an intention that caught both of them by surprise. And then, impossibly, his hips began to sway, a gentle shift from left to right that had nothing to do with the wheelchair and everything to do with the music that was moving through him. Rosa froze, not out of alarm but out of awe. She watched as Noah's movements became more deliberate, his body finding a rhythm that transcended the limitations everyone had accepted as permanent. His legs didn't lift, but his feet began to slide across the mat on the floor, tiny movements that were nonetheless unmistakably intentional. "You're moving," Rosa whispered, her voice thick with amazement and something that might have been tears. Noah looked at her, then down at his feet, as if he too was surprised by what his body was remembering. The ribbon between their hands continued to flutter with their shared motion, connecting them in this moment of breakthrough that was happening, not because of medical intervention, but because of the simple decision to dance together. Rosa didn't push for more or try to amplify what was happening. She waited, holding the space for Noah to explore this new possibility at his own pace. And then he did it again. The subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other, the gentle sway of his hips, the movement that might not have qualified as dancing by any formal definition but was absolutely, undeniably alive. Edward walked into the room mid-movement, intending only to check on their progress before his evening conference calls. What he saw stopped him completely. His son, moving with purpose and rhythm, his face calm but focused as he participated in something that looked remarkably like joy. Edward's mind tried to analyze what he was witnessing, to find medical explanations for movement that every specialist had declared impossible. But his heart knew better. This wasn't about muscle reflexes or neurological recovery. This was about Noah choosing to engage with the world again, choosing to trust that movement could be safe and that rhythm could be a bridge back to life. The profound moment broke something open inside Edward, some carefully guarded door that grief had welded shut. Watching his son dance, seeing the subtle smile that was beginning to transform Noah's face, Edward felt his own body responding to the music for the first time in years. He found himself stepping forward, his shoes forgotten as his bare feet found the rhythm that Rosa and Noah had created. The movement felt awkward at first, unfamiliar after years of rigid control, but gradually his body remembered what it felt like to sway without purpose, other than the simple pleasure of motion. Rosa saw him approach and smiled, extending the second end of the ribbon in an invitation that required no words. Edward took it with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the magnitude of what was happening. For the first time since Lillian's death, the three of them were connected, not by obligation or necessity, but by choice, by the shared decision to create something beautiful together. They didn't dance perfectly. Edward's movements were tentative and self-conscious. Noah's were limited by his physical condition, and Rosa had to accommodate both of their constraints while maintaining the rhythm that held them all together. But perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was, and in that, they succeeded completely. Edward found himself standing behind Noah, one hand on his son's shoulder and the other connected to Rosa through the yellow ribbon that had become their lifeline to each other. The music continued to play, and gradually Edward stopped thinking about anything other than the present moment. The weight of Noah's body as he leaned into the movement, the warmth of Rosa's presence as she guided them both through the steps of a dance that existed nowhere except in this room. Between these three people who had found each other across the boundaries of loss and hope, for the first time since Lillian's death, Edward felt himself surrender to something larger than his own will. His mind didn't analyze or strategize or attempt to control the outcome. He simply moved with his son and the woman who had somehow become essential to their healing, following a rhythm that seemed to emerge from some deep place of memory and love. When the music finally faded, they continued swaying for a few moments more, reluctant to break the spell that had transformed their broken family into something that felt almost whole again. Edward slowly released the ribbon, kneeling to face Noah directly, his hands resting gently on his son's knees. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and cracking with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Noah didn't speak, but his eyes met his father's and held them, the first sustained eye contact they had shared since the accident. In that gaze, Edward saw not the broken child he had been trying to fix, but the complete person his son had always been, waiting patiently for someone to see him as whole rather than damaged. Rosa stepped back quietly, giving them space for this moment of reconnection while carefully folding the ribbon that had facilitated their miracle. She didn't need to say anything or document what had happened, or call attention to the significance of what they had accomplished together. The dance itself was enough, proof that healing was possible when approached with patience, respect, and the radical belief that every person deserved to experience joy. Rosa had always known there were gaps in her family history, spaces where information should have been but wasn't, questions that her mother deflected with the gentle skill of someone who had practiced avoiding difficult truths. Growing up, Rosa had accepted these silences as part of the immigrant experience. Stories lost in translation, memories too painful to share, a past that belonged to another country and another life. But the charity gala in the penthouse ballroom changed everything. It was an annual event that Edward had maintained more out of obligation than enthusiasm, a gathering of donors and dignitaries who supported children's medical research. Rosa hadn't planned to attend. She had no reason to be there and even less desire to navigate the complex social dynamics of Manhattan's elite. But Carla had insisted she take a break from her work and spend a few minutes observing the evening's festivities. "It's for the children," Carla had said with a half-joking smile. "You qualify now." So Rosa had put on her simplest navy dress and positioned herself near the catering staff, content to watch from the margins as champagne glasses clinked and conversation flowed around topics she couldn't pretend to understand. The evening passed uneventfully until a prominent donor unveiled a large commemorative display, a black and white photograph from the early 1980s blown up and mounted in an elegant frame. The image showed Edward's father, Harold Grant, shaking hands with a young woman who appeared to be receiving some kind of recognition or award. She was slender and dark-skinned, with thick curls and high cheekbones that created a face of striking beauty and intelligence. Something about her expression, confident but reserved, pleased but slightly guarded, caught Rosa's attention and held it. Then Rosa read the small plaque beneath the photograph, and her world tilted on its axis. Harold Grant, 1983, Education Initiative, Brazil. Rosa's heart stopped. Her mother had been in Brazil in 1983, working as a translator for educational programs that brought American funding to underserved communities. She had spoken of those years often, of the man with pale blue eyes who had appreciated her work, who had treated her with respect, when others saw only another local employee who had possessed what she called important hands and dangerous kindness. But her mother had never mentioned the man's name. She had never explained why she returned to the United States pregnant and alone, or why she had always deflected Rosa's questions about her father with vague references to complications and different worlds that couldn't meet. Rosa stared at the photograph until her vision blurred, seeing in the young woman's face an older version of her own features, recognizing in her posture the same careful dignity that Rosa had inherited without understanding its source. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidental, too specific to be explained away by wishful thinking or imagination. She left the gala early, slipping away from the ballroom with her heart pounding and her mind racing through memories that suddenly carried new significance. Her mother's stories about the American businessmen who had changed her life, the way she had always spoken of the United States as if it were a place she had been meant to find, the sadness that would sometimes cross her face when Rosa asked about family, about connections, about the people they had left behind. That night, Rosa couldn't sleep. She sat by her window looking out at the city lights and trying to process the possibility that her employment in the Grant penthouse hadn't been coincidence, but some form of destiny. That she had been drawn to Noah and Edward not by chance, but by blood ties she had never known existed. The questions multiplied in her mind like ripples in still water. If Harold Grant was her father, then Edward was her half-brother. Noah was her nephew. The family she had been helping to heal was her own family, connected by secrets that had been buried for decades. But suspicion wasn't proof, and Rosa had learned early in life not to build hope on speculation. If she was going to pursue this possibility, she needed evidence, something concrete that could confirm or dismiss the growing certainty in her heart. She waited 3 days before returning to the storage room, using her cleaning duties as cover for a more thorough exploration of the penthouse's hidden history. She moved carefully through the boxes and cabinets, not searching randomly but following the same intuition that had led her to dance with Noah, the sense that important truths were waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough to look for them. It took almost an hour of careful searching before she found what she was looking for, a plain envelope tucked behind a row of encyclopedias that appeared to have been undisturbed for years. Her fingers went cold as she pulled it free and read the careful handwriting on the front. "For my other daughter." Rosa's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid someone might hear it echoing through the storage room. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and an official document that would change her understanding of everything. The birth certificate was simple and devastating. Rosa Miles, father listed as Harold James Grant. The dates, the location, the bureaucratic language that reduced a complex human story to a few typed lines. It was all there, undeniable proof of a connection she had never been told about. The letter was brief, written in the same handwriting as the envelope. "If you ever find this, I hope the timing is right. I hope your mother told you enough to find your way to this house. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to know you. I hope you found what you needed without me. But if you're here, then maybe something beautiful happened anyway." Rosa read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated her consciousness. Harold Grant had known about her existence. He had known and chosen not to be part of her life. But he had also hoped that somehow she would find her way to the family he couldn't give her directly. She didn't confront Edward immediately. The magnitude of the discovery needed time to settle, and she wanted to understand her own feelings before attempting to explain them to someone else. She continued her work in the penthouse for several more days, but everything felt different now. The spaces she cleaned, the people she interacted with, the quiet moments she shared with Noah all carried new weight and significance. Edward was her half-brother. The realization should have changed how she felt about their relationship, should have made their interactions more complicated or more meaningful. But what surprised Rosa was how little it changed the essential truth of what they had built together. She had come to care for Noah and Edward not because of any genetic connection, but because they were people who needed what she could offer. Blood relationship didn't diminish that care. It simply provided context for why the connection had felt so natural from the beginning. When she finally decided to share her discovery, Rosa chose to do it simply and directly, without drama or elaborate revelation. She found Edward in his study one evening, sitting with the letter from Lillian still visible on his desk, a glass of scotch untouched beside him. "I think you should see this," she said quietly, offering him the envelope she had found. Edward took it with the careful attention he had learned to give to anything Rosa brought him. When he read the name on the front, his face went pale, his hands freezing as the implications began to sink in. "I don't understand," he whispered as he opened the letter and scanned its contents. "She never told me, I didn't know." Rosa stood in patient silence while Edward processed the revelation, watching as understanding slowly replaced confusion in his expression. When he looked up at her again, his eyes were wide with something between disbelief and recognition. "You're my sister," he said slowly, as if speaking the words aloud would help them become real. "Half," Rosa corrected gently. "But yes." The silence that followed was profound but not uncomfortable. They were both absorbing the reality that their connection had deeper roots than either of them had known, that Rosa's intuitive understanding of Noah's needs and Edward's pain might have been guided by something more than professional compassion. "You're the woman with my father's eyes," Edward said finally, his voice filled with wonder and regret. Rosa exhaled a breath that felt like it had been waiting years to escape. "I always wondered where they came from." For the first time since Rosa had entered his life, Edward looked at her and saw not the cleaning woman who had saved his son, but the sister he had never known he had, the daughter Harold Grant had acknowledged in private but never claimed in public, the family member who had found her way home through service rather than inheritance. The discovery explained so much: Why Rosa had seemed to understand the house and its rhythms so quickly, why her presence had felt necessary rather than merely helpful, why her connection to Noah had transcended the usual boundaries between caregiver and patient. She hadn't been a stranger offering assistance to a broken family. She had been family herself, answering a call that had been waiting decades to be heard. Edward couldn't sleep that night. The envelope containing proof of Rosa's identity sat on his desk like evidence of a reality he wasn't prepared to accept, challenging everything he thought he understood about coincidence, family, and the forces that had brought them together. He found Rosa the next morning in Noah's room, going through her usual routine of gentle cleaning, while humming melodies that now carried new significance. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, something in his expression made her pause mid-motion, her hand stilling on the cloth she had been using to dust the windowsill. "Rosa," he said, his voice raw and unfamiliar to himself. "I need to tell you something." She straightened, setting down her cleaning supplies with the careful attention of someone preparing for important news. Her expression was alert but calm, as if she had been expecting this conversation and was ready for whatever it might bring. "I found another letter," Edward continued, his words coming slower than he intended. "From my father, addressed to his other daughter." The carefully constructed distance between them, the professional boundary that had defined their relationship for months, dissolved completely in that moment. Rosa's breath caught as the full weight of his words settled between them, confirming what she had already known but somehow making it more real. "It's you," Edward said, his voice nearly breaking on the simple words. "You're my sister." For a moment, everything hung perfectly still. Rosa felt her hands clench slightly at her sides as she processed the confirmation of what she had discovered in the storage room. But instead of relief or joy or any of the emotions she might have expected, what came was something more complex, a sense of loss for the simplicity they were about to leave behind. "I was just a cleaner," she whispered, the words emerging without conscious thought. "I didn't mean to clean your history." The sentence landed like a blow that neither of them knew how to absorb. It carried the weight of everything that was about to change. The innocence of their connection, the purity of Rosa's motivations, the belief that what they had built together was based on choice rather than obligation. Rosa turned and left without another word, walking out of the room, out of the penthouse, out of the life they had been building together with such careful patience. Edward didn't follow her. He couldn't. He watched her disappear down the hallway, carrying with her not just the revelation of their shared blood, but the fear that everything meaningful between them had been based on secrets neither of them had chosen to keep. The next few days passed in a silence that was different from any they had experienced before. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of healing or the comfortable rhythm of work being done well. It was the hollow absence left behind when something essential had been removed from a carefully balanced system. Noah regressed almost immediately. Not dramatically or completely, but enough to remind Edward how fragile their progress had been. The small movements that had begun to return to his son's body became stilted again. The humming that had started to fill their rooms faded back into silence. The light that had begun to return to Noah's eyes dimmed, as if he understood that the person who had called him back to life was no longer there to maintain the connection. Edward tried to continue the routines that Rosa had established. He brought the yellow ribbon to Noah's room and attempted to recreate the gentle movements they had shared, but his efforts felt mechanical and forced. Without Rosa's intuitive understanding of rhythm and patience, the exercises became empty gestures that seemed to highlight their loss rather than bridge it. He considered calling Rosa more than once, his phone in his hand and her number displayed on the screen. But what could he say? How do you ask someone to return to a relationship that had been fundamentally altered by truths neither of you had been prepared to face? How do you explain that the family secret you had never known existed had somehow made everything feel less authentic rather than more meaningful? Dr. Chen returned for Noah's scheduled therapy session and immediately noticed the change in his responsiveness. The small victories they had achieved during Rosa's time with them seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a child who was once again locked in the protective silence that had defined him for years. "Has there been any change in his routine?" Dr. Chen asked, her professional concern evident as she documented Noah's regression. "Any disruption to his environment or care?" Edward couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. The truth was too complex, too charged with emotions he didn't understand, and too private to share with someone who would inevitably try to analyze it through the lens of psychological theory. "Some staffing changes," he said vaguely, the words feeling like betrayal even as he spoke them. Carla noticed the difference too, though she was too diplomatic to comment directly on Rosa's absence. Instead, she mentioned practical concerns, the way Noah's eating had decreased again, how his sleep patterns seemed more disrupted, the return of the blank stare that they had all hoped was disappearing permanently. "He's asking for her," Carla said one afternoon, her voice gentle but pointed. "Not in words, but in the way he looks toward the door. He's waiting for someone who isn't coming." Edward felt the accusation in her words, even though Carla had offered it as observation rather than judgment. Noah was waiting for Rosa, and Edward was the reason she wasn't there. Not because he had sent her away in anger, but because he had allowed the revelation of their blood relationship to poison something that had been pure and healing. On the fourth day of Rosa's absence, Edward sat beside Noah's wheelchair in the evening light, watching his son stare out the window with the same vacant expression that had characterized the 3 years before Rosa's arrival. The progress they had made, the movement, the connection, the small miracles of engagement, felt like a dream that was fading with each passing hour. "I don't know what to do," Edward confessed aloud, speaking to his silent son as if Noah might offer guidance or absolution. "I don't know how to move forward without her." Noah didn't answer, of course, but something in his posture, the slight turn of his head, the way his fingers curved inward, suggested that he was listening, that he understood the loss they were both experiencing. That night, Edward found himself in Rosa's former workspace, standing among the cleaning supplies and equipment that had been her domain for months. Everything was organized with the same careful attention to detail she had brought to every aspect of her work. But the space felt abandoned, waiting for someone who might never return. He picked up the small speaker she had used to play music during her sessions with Noah, turning it over in his hands like an artifact from a civilization that had disappeared without explanation. The device held memories of melodies that had filled their home with life, rhythms that had called his son back from silence, and taught a grieving father how to dance again. Edward understood with the clarity that comes from loss that what Rosa had given them wasn't diminished by the revelation of their family connection. If anything, it was more remarkable. She had offered them healing, not because she was obligated to by blood or employment, but because she had seen need and chosen to respond to it with everything she had to give. The love she had shown Noah, the patience she had offered Edward, the quiet revolution she had brought to their lives, none of that became less meaningful because they shared a father. It became more precious, more rare, more worthy of protection and gratitude. But understanding that truth and knowing how to act on it were entirely different challenges. Edward had built his life around control and certainty, around the belief that relationships could be managed like business deals if you understood the terms and conditions clearly enough. The discovery that Rosa was his sister had shattered that illusion, revealing that the most important connections in life often developed in spite of our planning, rather than because of it. As he stood alone in the space that Rosa had made sacred through her presence, Edward realized that he had a choice to make. He could allow the complexity of their relationship to paralyze him, could hide behind the confusion and uncertainty that the revelation had created. Or he could do what Rosa had taught him through her example, approach the situation with honesty and humility, trusting that truth shared with love was always better than silence maintained out of fear. The question was whether Rosa would be willing to hear what he needed to say, and whether the family they had discovered was strong enough to survive the shock of its own existence. Rosa's absence stretched into its 5th day before Edward understood that waiting for the right words or the perfect moment was just another form of the paralysis that had governed his life since Lillian's death. Some conversations couldn't be planned or controlled. They could only be entered with courage and the hope that truth would find its own path to understanding. He found Rosa in the small garden behind her apartment building, sitting on a bench with a book in her lap that she clearly wasn't reading. The afternoon light caught the highlights in her dark hair, and Edward was struck by how much she resembled the young woman in his father's photograph. The same combination of strength and vulnerability, the same careful dignity that suggested depths he was only beginning to understand. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path, her expression neither surprised nor welcoming, but not hostile either. It was the face of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared herself for whatever it might bring. "I want you to stay," Edward said without preamble, abandoning the careful speech he had rehearsed during the drive to her apartment. "Not just as a cleaner, not even just as what you've become to Noah. I mean stay permanently as part of this, as family." Rosa closed her book and set it aside, her movements deliberate and calm. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to answer now," Edward replied, sitting on the opposite end of the bench without asking permission. "I just want you to know that this place, our home, feels different when you're in it. Alive. And not just for Noah, for me too." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the small garden. Edward felt the familiar urge to fill the quiet with explanations or justifications, but Rosa's presence had taught him that some truths needed space to breathe before they could be properly understood. "There's something I need to understand first," Rosa said eventually, her voice soft but certain, "before I can say yes." Edward nodded, prepared for questions about logistics or boundaries, or the complex dynamics of their newly revealed relationship. But Rosa's concern was simpler and more fundamental than he had anticipated. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I will." That evening, the penthouse hosted the charity gala that would become a turning point in ways none of them could have predicted. Edward moved through the gathering with the practiced ease of someone who had attended hundreds of similar events, making conversations with donors and dignitaries, while his mind remained focused on the empty space where Rosa should have been. She arrived near the end of the evening, dressed simply but elegantly, standing at the edge of the ballroom like someone who belonged there but chose to observe rather than participate. Edward caught sight of her from across the room and felt something in his chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but the first suggestion that healing might still be possible. Rosa made her way through the crowd with quiet purpose, drawn by the same commemorative display that had first revealed the truth about her parentage. The photograph of Harold Grant and the young woman from Brazil seemed to glow under the gallery lights, demanding attention from anyone who looked closely enough to see the connections it contained. But this time, Rosa wasn't looking at the image with the shock of recognition. She was studying it with the careful attention of someone trying to understand not just what had happened, but why it had remained hidden for so long. An elderly man approached her as she stood before the display, his movements careful but confident. "Beautiful photograph," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "I knew them both, you know, Harold and Maria." Rosa turned to face him, her heart beginning to race as she recognized the possibility that this stranger might hold pieces of the story she had been trying to understand. "Maria, your mother," the man said gently. "You have her eyes, but Harold's chin. I wondered if you would ever find your way here." The conversation that followed filled in details that Rosa had been missing for decades. Dr. Carlos Mendoza had worked as a coordinator for the education initiative that brought Harold Grant to Brazil in 1983. He had witnessed the relationship that developed between the American businessman and the young translator who helped navigate the complex cultural and linguistic challenges of the project. They loved each other, Dr. Mendoza said simply. But Harold was married and Maria was proud. She chose to leave before the situation became impossible for both of them. Harold never knew about you until years later, when it was too late to change what had already been decided. Rosa listened to the story of her origins with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Her mother had made an impossible choice between love and integrity, between happiness and honor. Harold had been left to wonder what might have been, carrying guilt and regret that eventually led him to write the letter Rosa had found in the storage room. "He tried to find you both," Dr. Mendoza continued, "after his wife died, when Edward was still young. But Maria had made a new life, and she asked him to respect her decision to keep the past in the past. So he did, but he never stopped hoping that someday you might find each other." The revelation recontextualized everything Rosa thought she understood about her discovery of the Grant family. It hadn't been coincidence that led her to the penthouse, but it also hadn't been manipulation or destiny in any simple sense. It had been the slow working of love across time and distance, creating opportunities for connection that could only be seized by people brave enough to recognize them. Edward found her as the gala was ending, standing alone in front of the photograph with tears in her eyes, but something that looked like peace in her expression. "Now I understand," she said without turning to face him. "I'm not here by accident, but I'm not here because of obligation either. I'm here because sometimes love finds a way to finish what it started, even when the people who began it can't see the ending." Edward moved to stand beside her, both of them looking at the image of their father and Rosa's mother, captured in a moment of professional collaboration that had contained so much more than either of them could acknowledge at the time. "Will you come home?" Edward asked quietly. Rosa turned to face him, her eyes clear and certain. "Yes," she said, "but not as your employee, not as a stranger who happened to help, as family. As someone who chooses to be here because this is where I belong." They left the gala together, riding the elevator to the penthouse in comfortable silence. When the doors opened to reveal the familiar expanse of marble and chrome that had become Rosa's workplace and Edward's prison, the space felt different. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the people entering it had been transformed by truth and choice, and the decision to build something new from the foundation of what they had already discovered together. Noah was awake when they entered his room, sitting in his wheelchair by the window as if he had been waiting for this moment. When he saw Rosa, his face lit up with something that could only be called joy, pure, uncomplicated happiness at the return of someone he had thought was lost. Rosa knelt beside his wheelchair and took his hands in hers, her voice soft but steady as she spoke. "I'm sorry I left," she said. "I needed to understand something important, but I'm not leaving again. We're family now. All of us." Noah didn't speak, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that conveyed everything words couldn't capture. He understood in the way that children sometimes do that something fundamental had changed. Not just Rosa's position in their household, but the very nature of what they were building together. That night, for the first time since the revelation of their relationship, the three of them gathered in the living room, where Rosa had first danced with Noah. Edward brought out the yellow ribbon that had become their shared symbol, and slowly, carefully, they began to move together again. The dance was different this time. more tentative at first, as if they were all learning new steps. But gradually, as the music played and their bodies found the familiar rhythm, the joy returned. Rosa spun gently with Noah's hand in hers while Edward provided steady support from behind, and for a few perfect minutes, they were simply a family dancing together in their living room. When the music ended, they remained connected by the ribbon and by something much stronger, the understanding that they had chosen each other not once but twice, first as strangers drawn together by need and compassion, and then as family willing to rebuild their connection on the foundation of truth. 6 months had passed since the revelation that changed everything, and the penthouse had been transformed in ways that went far beyond the addition of Rosa as a permanent family member. The sterile perfection that had once characterized every room had given way to something warmer, more alive, spaces that showed evidence of being lived in by people who had learned to value connection over control. Music played freely throughout the day now, not as background noise, but as an essential element of the atmosphere Rosa and Edward had created together. Noah's laughter could be heard echoing down the hallways, still rare but no longer shocking when it occurred. The careful distance that grief had imposed on every interaction had been replaced by the messy, imperfect closeness of a family, learning how to love each other without fear. But perhaps the most significant change was the decision they had made together to share their healing with others. The Stillness Center had grown from a simple idea. What if other families could benefit from what Rosa had discovered about reaching children through patience and respect rather than clinical intervention? Into a comprehensive program that was revolutionizing how people thought about trauma recovery and human connection. Edward and Rosa had co-founded the center not as experts or professionals, but as people who had learned through experience that healing often came through the most unexpected channels. They brought together traditional medical expertise with Rosa's intuitive understanding of rhythm and movement, creating an approach that honored both the science of recovery and the art of being present with another person's pain. The program wasn't about curing or fixing anything. It was about creating spaces where children and families could explore what connection felt like when it wasn't filtered through diagnostic criteria or treatment goals. Rosa trained volunteers in the patient observation she had used with Noah, how to watch for the small signals that indicated readiness for interaction, how to offer invitation without pressure, how to follow rather than lead in the delicate dance of trust building. On the day of the center's public launch, the penthouse had been carefully transformed to serve as both a demonstration space and a celebration venue. The grand hallway that had once been a cold corridor of silence was cleared to create a performance area, with folding chairs arranged on either side for parents, doctors, and the curious observers who had come to witness something they had been told was impossible. Edward stood at one end of the improvised stage, wearing a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking more like a nervous father than a billionaire CEO. Rosa was beside him in a flowing dress that allowed for easy movement, her hands never straying far from Noah, who sat in his wheelchair with an expression of calm anticipation that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The audience was filled with faces Edward recognized: medical professionals who had worked with Noah over the years, other parents of children with disabilities, journalists who had come to document what some were calling a revolutionary approach to pediatric therapy. But there were also many people he didn't know. Families who had heard about their program through word of mouth, therapists who were curious about methods that couldn't be taught in textbooks, children whose eyes held the same guarded hope that had once defined Noah's expression. "You don't have to do anything," Rosa said quietly, bending down to meet Noah's eyes. "You already did it, but if you want to, we'll be right here." Noah looked up at her with the kind of trust that can only be built through months of consistent presence and gentle invitation. He placed his hand on the walker that had become his bridge between the wheelchair and independent movement, not because anyone had told him to, but because he understood that this moment was his choice to make. Edward knelt beside Rosa, his voice soft but steady, as he addressed his son. "Whatever you decide is perfect. We're proud of you no matter what." The room fell silent as Noah gripped the walker with both hands and slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. The movement wasn't smooth or effortless. His legs trembled with the effort, and his face showed the concentration required to coordinate muscles that had been dormant for years. But it was unmistakably intentional, a choice made not from obligation, but from the desire to share something beautiful with people who had gathered to witness it. His first step was careful, more of a controlled lean than actual movement. The second was more confident. By the third, he had found his rhythm, the same careful, purposeful pace that had characterized all of his healing. When he reached the center of the improvised stage, he stopped, straightened as much as his condition allowed, and offered a small bow that carried more dignity than any formal gesture Edward had ever witnessed. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, but Noah seemed to expect it rather than be surprised by it. He had learned through months of gentle encouragement that his efforts to connect with the world were worthy of celebration, that his courage to move beyond the protective silence of trauma deserved recognition. But the most remarkable moment was still to come. Without being prompted or guided, Noah reached to his side and picked up the yellow ribbon that had become the symbol of their shared healing. He held it up for a moment, letting it unravel like a banner of hope, and then began to move. It wasn't fast or dramatic, but it was unmistakably dancing. Noah spun slowly, his feet planted, but his torso engaged in the rhythm that Rosa had taught him, the walker providing stability while his spirit provided the movement. The ribbon fluttered around him as he turned, catching the light from the windows and creating patterns that seemed to embody the joy that had slowly returned to his life. The audience erupted in applause again, but this time Edward barely heard it. He was too focused on his son's face, on the expression of pure presence and contentment that had replaced the blank stare of trauma. Noah was dancing not because he had been asked to, but because movement had become a language he could speak fluently, a way of communicating joy that transcended the limitations that the accident had imposed on his body. Rosa stepped forward to join Noah's dance, and Edward followed without hesitation. The three of them moved together in the center of the improvised stage, their movements simple but profound, their connection visible to everyone who watched. They weren't performing for the audience. They were simply sharing what they had discovered together. The truth that healing was possible when it was approached with patience, respect, and the radical belief that every person deserved to experience joy. Around them, something remarkable began to happen. Children in the audience started clapping in time with the music, their bodies instinctively responding to the rhythm that filled the space. Parents reached for each other's hands, creating their own small connections across the rows of chairs. Several people began moving in their seats, swaying gently as if they too were being invited into the dance that had started with 3 people and was now expanding to include everyone present. What had begun as a demonstration of one family's healing became a celebration of the universal human capacity for connection and renewal. The rigid boundaries between performer and audience, between those who needed healing and those who offered it, dissolved into something more fluid and inclusive. A community of people who had chosen to believe that movement was possible even when everything seemed still. When the music finally faded, the 3 of them remained connected at the center of the stage, their breathing synchronized, and their faces glowing with the satisfaction of having shared something true and beautiful. The applause continued, but it felt different now. Not just appreciation for what they had witnessed, but recognition of what they had all participated in. Edward looked out at the faces surrounding them and saw the same transformation he had experienced in his own life reflected in dozens of expressions. People who had arrived skeptical or curious were leaving convinced that they had witnessed something that would change how they thought about healing, about family, about the possibilities that existed when people approached each other with genuine care. But the most profound change was in Edward himself. As he stood with his arm around Noah's shoulders and Rosa's hand in his, he felt the final pieces of the grief that had defined him for years shift into something else. Not disappearance, but integration. Not forgetting, but remembering with love instead of pain. She would be so proud, he whispered, speaking to Noah but meaning it for all of them. Rosa nodded, understanding that he was referring not just to Lillian, but to his mother as well, to Harold, to all the people who had loved them enough to create the circumstances that brought them together. I think she already is, Rosa replied, and this time Edward knew she was right. The evening that followed was filled with conversations that would lead to partnerships, funding opportunities, and the gradual expansion of their program to other cities and other families. But what mattered most to Edward was the quiet moment when they returned to the penthouse after the last guest had left, when the 3 of them sat together in the living room, where it had all begun, and simply appreciated the silence that no longer felt empty but full. Noah hummed softly as he settled into his wheelchair, the same melody that Rosa had first played months earlier. Edward found himself humming along, his voice joining with theirs in a harmony that wasn't perfect, but was perfectly theirs. And Rosa, listening to the 2 men she had learned to love as family, understood that they had created something that transcended the individual healing they had each needed. They had become proof that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through grand gestures or expensive interventions, but through the simple decision to see another person as worthy of patience, respect, and unconditional love. 2 years later, the Stillness Center had expanded beyond anything Edward and Rosa had initially imagined. What began as a single program in a converted penthouse had grown into a network of centers across 3 countries, each one staffed by people who had learned that healing often came through the most unexpected channels. The methodology they had developed, if it could even be called methodology, wasn't something that could be easily replicated or mass-produced. It required individuals who were willing to approach each child as a complete person rather than a collection of symptoms, who understood that breakthrough moments often looked like nothing more than a blink or a twitch to untrained eyes, who had the patience to build trust one gentle interaction at a time. Rosa had become the center's director of training, though her title barely captured the scope of what she did. She traveled regularly to new locations, teaching volunteers and professionals how to recognize the subtle languages that children used when words weren't available, how to offer invitation without pressure, how to create spaces where healing could unfold organically rather than being imposed from outside. Edward had restructured his business interests to focus primarily on funding the center's expansion and researching new approaches to trauma recovery. Grant Technologies still thrived under the leadership of executives he trusted, but his attention had shifted to work that felt more essential, creating opportunities for other families to discover what his family had found through Rosa's presence. And Noah had become something none of them had expected, a teacher, not in any formal sense, but in the way that his story inspired other children and families to believe that change was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise. He spoke now, though sparingly, and his words carried the weight of someone who had chosen silence and then chosen to break it. When he told other children that healing was worth the effort it required, they believed him in ways they might not believe adults who had never experienced their particular form of brokenness. On the second anniversary of the center's founding, they gathered once again in the penthouse living room where the first dance had taken place. The space looked different now, warmer, more lived in, filled with photographs and artwork created by children who had passed through their program. But the essential elements remained the same. The open floor where movement was always possible, the windows that let in light and music, the sense that this was a place where miracles could unfold quietly without fanfare or dramatic announcement. Noah, now 11, had grown taller and stronger, though he still used his wheelchair for longer distances and his walker for the careful steps that had become his signature form of dancing. His face had lost the guarded blankness that trauma had imposed, replaced by the alert curiosity of a child who had learned that the world could be trusted to offer beauty as well as pain. Rosa had changed too, though the transformation was subtler. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had discovered her purpose and chosen to embrace it fully. The careful reserve that had characterized her first months in the penthouse had given way to something more open, more willing to claim space and voice opinions and believe that her perspective mattered. But perhaps the most dramatic change was in Edward. The rigid control that had once governed every aspect of his life had been replaced by something more flexible, more responsive to the unexpected opportunities that each day might bring. He laughed more, worried less, and had learned to find joy in small moments that wouldn't have registered on his radar just years earlier. As the three of them prepared for what had become their traditional anniversary dance, Edward reflected on how impossible this moment would have seemed when Rosa first arrived as part of the cleaning crew. A billionaire, a former maid who had become family, and a child who had been pronounced unreachable by some of the best medical minds in the world. Together, they had created something that couldn't be explained by psychology textbooks or business strategies. "Are you ready?" Rosa asked, offering the yellow ribbon that had become their shared symbol. Noah nodded, rising from his wheelchair with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to trust his body's ability to support him in moments that mattered. Edward took his position beside them, no longer self-conscious about the awkwardness of his movements or worried about maintaining the dignity that had once seemed so important. The music began, the same wordless melody that had started everything, now familiar as breathing, but still capable of creating magic when the right people moved to its rhythm. They danced slowly, carefully, each of them accommodating the other's limitations while contributing their own strengths to the shared movement. But this time, they weren't alone. Other families had joined them in the living room, children and parents who had found their own forms of healing through the center's program. Some moved in wheelchairs, others used walkers or canes, and several danced with no assistance other than the music and the encouragement of people who understood that every form of movement was worthy of celebration. The penthouse filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, with music that came from speakers and voices alike, with the gentle percussion of feet and wheels and assistive devices all finding their own way to participate in the rhythm that connected them all. Edward watched a little girl with cerebral palsy spin in her wheelchair, while her mother clapped in time with the music. He saw a boy who had been selectively mute for 3 years whisper a request to his father for a specific song. He observed dozens of small miracles that would never make headlines or inspire research grants, but that represented the most profound victory possible, the decision to keep moving forward even when the path wasn't clear. "Look," Rosa said softly, gesturing toward Noah, who had begun to hum along with the music while he danced. But Noah wasn't just humming for himself. He had begun to teach the melody to a younger child who was visiting the center for the first time, patiently repeating the phrases until the other boy could follow along. The two of them moved together, Noah providing gentle guidance while the younger child discovered that his body could create rhythm and beauty. Despite the challenges that had brought him to seek help, Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion that no longer embarrassed him. This was what Lillian had meant when she wrote about teaching Noah to dance. Not the literal steps or movements, but the deeper understanding that joy was always possible, that connection could always be chosen, that healing happened not when problems were solved, but when people decided to love each other through the complexity of being human. The evening continued until well past the children's usual bedtimes, families reluctant to leave a space where their struggles felt understood, and their progress, however small, was celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. But eventually the guests departed, leaving Rosa, Edward, and Noah alone in the living room that had become sacred to them. They sat together in the comfortable silence that had replaced the devastating quiet of earlier years, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the windows and listening to the gentle sounds of a home where people felt safe to be exactly who they were. "What do you think happens next?" Edward asked, speaking to both of them, but particularly curious about Noah's perspective. Noah considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all conversations now, his face thoughtful as he weighed possibilities that would once have seemed impossible to contemplate. "More dancing," he said finally, his voice clear and certain. "More families, more kids who think they can't move learning that they can." Rosa nodded, understanding that Noah had articulated not just their plans for the center's expansion, but something deeper about the way healing spreads from person to person, family to family, community to community when people are brave enough to share what they've learned. "More dancing," she agreed, and Edward knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way they had faced everything else, together with patience and with the absolute conviction that movement was always possible for those willing to take the first step. The penthouse settled into sleep around them, but the music seemed to linger in the air not as sound but as presence, as promise, as the ongoing echo of all the joy they had created together, and all the joy still waiting to be discovered. In the morning, there would be new families to meet, new children to encourage, new forms of healing to explore and share. But tonight there was simply this: three people who had found each other across the boundaries of class and blood and circumstance, who had learned that the most profound medicine often came disguised as something as simple as the decision to dance when the world expected you to sit still. Outside the windows, the city continued its restless movement, millions of people navigating their own forms of stillness and motion, silence and song. And in one penthouse 57 floors above the street, a family born from loss and choice and the radical belief in possibility continued the dance that had saved them all, keeping time with a rhythm that would never end as long as there were people willing to move together toward hope. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine. It comes from movement. Sometimes family isn't defined by blood alone, but by the choice to see another person as worthy of unconditional love. And sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through grand gestures, but through the simple decision to dance when the world tells you to sit still. This story reminds us that every person, no matter how broken they might appear, carries within them an essential spark that can be reached by someone willing to approach them with patience, respect, and genuine care. The Stillness Center continues its work today, proof that miracles happen every day in the quiet spaces between one person reaching out and another choosing to respond. What began with a billionaire catching his maid dancing with his paralyzed son became a revolution in how we think about healing, family, and the unlimited power of human connection. Because in the end, we are all just people learning how to move together through the complicated dance of being alive.